The night air over New York carried a strange silence, the kind that settles only after decades of violence have finally slowed. In the quiet shadows of Queens, the name John Gotti Jr. still echoed like a ghost of another era. He was born into a world where loyalty was currency, silence was survival, and bloodlines mattered more than innocence. From the moment he opened his eyes, his destiny was shaped not by choice, but by legacy. John Angelo Gotti Jr. entered life, surrounded by power most people only read about. His father, John Gotti, was not just a gangster, he was a symbol, known across America as the Dapper Don. The elder Gotti commanded fear and admiration in equal measure. Tailored suits, confident smiles, and courtroom victories turned him into a media legend. But behind that polished image was a ruthless leader at the top of the Gambino crime family, one of the most powerful criminal organizations in U.S. history. For John Gotti Jr., childhood was anything but ordinary. While other children worried about school and friends, his world revolved around whispered conversations, guarded homes, and men who spoke in coded language. He learned early that family loyalty came before everything. In the Gotti household, respect was taught through example, not explanation. Doors were always watched, phones were always suspect, and trust was rare. As a boy, John Jr. saw his father as larger than life. When John Gotti walked into a room, the atmosphere changed. Men straightened their posture. Conversations paused. Power had a presence. And John Jr. absorbed it without realizing how deeply it would define him. Yet even in moments of family warmth, there was an invisible wall separating their world from everyone else's. This was not a life one could escape easily. Growing up in the shadow of America's most notorious mob boss meant John Jr. was constantly watched by rivals, by law enforcement, and by the media. The FBI didn't see a child, they saw a successor. Every move he made was documented, every friendship questioned. While his father thrived in attention, John Jr. learned caution. Silence became his armor. As he entered his teenage years, the pull of the underworld grew stronger. He wasn't forced into crime, but the path was always there, quietly waiting. Men connected to the family treated him with a mixture of respect and expectation. To them, he wasn't just John, he was the future. That pressure weighed heavily, even when unspoken. The streets of New York in those years were unforgiving. Organized crime was still deeply rooted, but the rules were changing. Old-school mobsters believed in honor and structure, while a new generation chased money without patience. John Jr. stood between those worlds, shaped by tradition, but surrounded by transformation. When his father rose to the absolute peak of power, the Gotti name became both a shield and a target. Lavish celebrations, high-profile trials, and constant media coverage turned the family into household news. John Jr. watched closely as his father defeated prosecutors again and again, earning an almost mythic reputation. To a son, it looked like invincibility. But power attracts enemies, and success invites downfall. Behind closed doors, the pressure on the Gotti family intensified. Surveillance increased. Informants whispered. Federal cases grew stronger. John Jr. began to understand that legacy was not just inherited, it was hunted. As a young man, he slowly stepped closer to the family business. Not with reckless ambition, but with careful calculation. He learned how meetings worked, how alliances were formed, and how disputes were settled quietly before turning deadly. He saw firsthand that leadership was not about violence alone. It was about control, influence, and fear wrapped in discipline. Then came the moment that changed everything. When John Gotti Sr. was finally convicted and sentenced to life in prison, the empire trembled. The Dapper Don was gone from the streets, locked behind concrete walls. For the first time, the Gambino family faced a future without its charismatic leader. And in that moment of uncertainty, all eyes turned to his son. John Gotti Jr. did not announce himself. He did not step forward with dramatic gestures. Instead, he inherited something far heavier than a title. He inherited responsibility. Expectations closed in from every direction. Old allies tested him. Rivals questioned his strength. Law enforcement watched closely, waiting for mistakes. Leadership, he discovered, was lonelier than power. Every decision carried consequences. Every conversation could be a trap. He had to balance honoring his father's legacy while surviving in a world that desperately wanted him to fail. Unlike his father, John Jr. preferred the shadows. He understood that visibility brought vulnerability. As pressure mounted, so did the risks. Federal prosecutors built cases piece by piece, determined to dismantle what remained of the Gotti influence. Trials, indictments, and courtroom battles became part of his life. Unlike the flashy victories of his father, John Jr.'s legal fights were grueling, exhausting, and relentless. The weight of the legacy began to show its cost. Relationships strained. Trust faded. Sleep became restless. The gangster life that once promised power now offered only endless conflict. Every step forward felt like walking deeper into a maze with no clear exit. Yet even as the walls closed in, John Gotti Jr. remained a symbol. To some, he was the rightful heir of a fallen empire. To others, he was a reminder that the old Mafia era was dying. And to law enforcement, he was proof that bloodlines still mattered in organized crime. In the quiet moments, away from meetings and courtrooms, John Jr. faced a question his father never had to answer the same way. Was legacy worth the sacrifice? The world he inherited was no longer glamorous. It was watched, weakened, and surrounded by consequences. The story of John Gotti Jr. is not just about crime. It is about identity, inheritance, and the heavy price of being born into power. His life stands at the crossroads between the golden age of the American Mafia and its slow, painful decline. A son carrying a name too powerful to escape, yet too dangerous to fully embrace. And as the city slept, the legacy of the Gotti name continued to breathe. Quietly in the darkness, no longer roaring, but refusing to disappear. The prison gates closed behind John Gotti, but the echo of his power did not disappear with him. In the outside world, silence filled the space he left behind, and silence in the Mafia was never empty. It was full of questions, calculations, and quiet danger. Within that silence, John Gotti Jr. stood at the center of attention, whether he wanted it or not. The streets no longer celebrated openly. Meetings became quieter, locations shifted constantly, and familiar faces grew cautious. The old certainty that once defined the Gambino empire began to fracture. For decades, leadership had been clear and unquestioned. Now, every move required consensus, and every delay invited challenge. John Jr. felt the weight of unspoken expectations pressing down on him from all sides. He understood something crucial that many underestimated. Power in the modern underworld was no longer about dominance alone. It was about survival. Law enforcement had learned from past failures. Surveillance technology improved. Informants were protected bare. And federal cases were built patiently rather than rushed. The glamorous image of organized crime had faded, replaced by relentless pressure and long prison sentences. John Jr. did not rush to fill his father's role publicly. Instead, he observed. He listened more than he spoke. He watched how alliances shifted in subtle ways. Some men remained loyal out of respect for the Gotti name. Others stayed close out of fear. And a few lingered only because opportunity often hid behind uncertainty. Every conversation carried hidden meaning. A compliment could be a test. A silence could be a warning. John Jr. learned to read people the way his father once read courtrooms, carefully, instinctively, and without revealing emotion. This was not a world that rewarded hesitation, but it punished recklessness even more. The federal spotlight intensified. Agents followed routines, tracked movements, and recorded patterns. John Jr. felt eyes on him even when streets appeared empty. The pressure was constant, like a low hum in the background of daily life. He knew the authorities wanted more than charges. They wanted the final dismantling of a dynasty. Despite the danger, expectations within the organization continued to grow. The Gambino family was not just a criminal enterprise. It was a system built on hierarchy and tradition. Members needed direction. Disputes needed resolution. Money needed to flow. Leadership, even when unofficial, demanded involvement. John Jr. stepped carefully into that role, aware that every decision could be used against him. He avoided unnecessary displays of power. Violence was minimized not out of mercy but strategy. In a time when one wrong move could lead to life imprisonment, subtlety became the strongest weapon. Yet restraint was often mistaken for weakness. Some within the underworld believed the era of the Gotti name was over. They whispered that the son lacked the fire of the father, that he was too cautious, too modern, too controlled. Those whispers carried danger, because ambition and organized crime often came dressed as criticism. John Jr. responded not with words, but with consistency. He maintained order. He ensured loyalty was rewarded and betrayal was discouraged without spectacle. His leadership style reflected the times, quiet, calculated, and deliberate. Those who understood the changing landscape respected him for it. Those who didn't became liabilities. As months turned into years, legal battles began to shape his life. Courtrooms replaced backrooms. Lawyers replaced lieutenants. Unlike his father's headline-grabbing trials, these proceedings were slower and far more exhausting. Multiple indictments emerged, each one threatening to end the story permanently. John Jr. found himself fighting not only the justice system, but the shadow of his own last name. Prosecutors didn't need him to be violent. They needed him to be symbolic. Convicting him meant closing a chapter in American organized crime history. The pressure began to reshape his priorities. The lifestyle he inherited no longer promised power. It promised constant fear and inevitable loss. Friends vanished. Some turned informants. Others disappeared into prison systems that swallowed men whole. Trust eroded. replaced by suspicion and distance. Behind closed doors, John Jr. confronted a reality few mob heirs openly admitted. The Mafia world his father dominated was dying. Technology, federal coordination, and cultural change had weakened the foundations that once made crime families untouchable. Loyalty no longer protected against wiretaps. Silence no longer guaranteed safety. And yet, walking away was not simple. Legacy has gravity. It pulls even those who try to escape its orbit. The Gotti name opened doors, but it also sealed exits. Every attempt to distance himself was met with doubt from authorities who didn't believe in redemption, and from associates who didn't believe in retreat. The strain took a personal toll. Peace became rare. Sleep came lightly. The mind never fully rested. Every future plan was shadowed by the possibility of arrest. Every ordinary moment carried extraordinary risk. This was not the glamorous gangster life portrayed in movies. It was a slow erosion of freedom. John Jr. began to consider something radical within the Mafia mindset: withdrawal, not betrayal, not cooperation, but disappearance from influence. A quiet step back rather than a dramatic fall. It was an idea that challenged decades of tradition, where leaving the life was often impossible without consequences. The thought lingered, growing stronger with each legal battle and broken alliance. He understood that survival no longer meant winning, it meant enduring. And endurance required sacrifice of identity. As the world outside moved forward, the old Mafia codes felt increasingly out of place. Younger generations no longer feared names the way they once did. The streets answered to different forces now: money, speed, and anonymity. The age of recognizable bosses was ending. John Gotti Jr. stood at the edge of that transformation, caught between past and future. A man born into power, shaped by caution, and haunted by expectations he never publicly claimed. His story was no longer just about crime. It was about choice. And in the quiet moments, when the city lights dimmed and the noise faded, the question returned. Again and again, how does a man step out of a shadow that defined his entire existence? The answer was not immediate. It would take time, loss, and a decision that would change everything. The idea of stepping away did not come easily to John Gotti Jr. In the world he was raised in, leaving was seen as betrayal, weakness, or fear. The streets did not forgive absence, and history showed that men who tried to disappear often paid a heavy price. Yet the life he lived no longer resembled the one his father once ruled. It had become something colder, tighter, and far less forgiving. Every day brought new pressure. Federal investigations expanded quietly, stretching across years instead of months. Prosecutors learned patience, waiting for patterns rather than chasing headlines. John Jr. felt time closing in on him, not dramatically, but steadily, like water rising inch by inch. The system no longer needed spectacle. It needed endurance. He understood that he was no longer fighting individual cases. He was fighting an idea, the idea that the Gotti legacy could still survive. And ideas were harder to defend than actions. His name alone carried weight in courtrooms, even when evidence was thin. Jurors didn't need to know details. They knew the history. Legal proceedings became cycles of preparation and uncertainty. Long hours with attorneys replaced nights of whispered conversations. Strategy shifted from control to defense. Each appearance in court drained energy, not because of fear, but because of inevitability. Win or lose, the pressure never lifted. Outside the legal arena, the underworld continued to fracture. Loyalty thinned as sentences grew longer. Old allies became cautious, distancing themselves to protect their own futures. Younger figures showed little respect for tradition, caring more about short-term gain than long-term order. The structure that once defined organized crime weakened under modern scrutiny. John Jr. noticed a shift in how people spoke to him. There was less confidence, more hesitation. Some treated him like a relic of a fading era. Others saw him as a risk rather than a leader. Power, he realized, was no longer inherited. It had to be constantly justified. The isolation deepened. Family gatherings no longer brought comfort. Conversations stayed surface level, guarded by shared anxiety. Everyone knew the dangers, but no one spoke openly about them. The burden of legacy had spread, touching everyone connected to the name. Even those far removed from the streets felt its weight. At night, when the city settled into restless sleep, John Jr. reflected on the life he never chose, but fully inherited. He thought about the contrast between perception and reality. The public imagined wealth, authority, and control. The truth was exhaustion, vigilance, and constant calculation. Freedom was the rarest currency of all. The turning point did not arrive with violence or betrayal. It came quietly, through accumulation. One case after another, one friendship after another lost to distance or fear. One reminder after another that the life offered no future beyond survival. The idea of stepping back transformed from weakness into strategy, but retreat carried risks of its own. Leaving influence behind meant redefining identity. Without power, without fear, who was John Gotti Jr.? A private citizen with a famous name still carried suspicion. The past could not be erased, only managed. The challenge was learning how to exist without constantly defending a legacy. He began to limit involvement further, drawing boundaries that once seemed impossible. Meetings became rare, conversations shorter, decisions delegated. It was not an announcement, but a gradual withdrawal. Those paying attention noticed. Some interpreted it as caution, others as surrender. Law enforcement noticed too. Reduced activity did not bring immediate relief. Surveillance continued. Investigations pressed on. Authorities assumed strategy rather than exit. In their view, stepping back was simply another tactic. Redemption was not part of their calculation. John Jr. found himself trapped between two unforgiving forces. The underworld demanded loyalty. The justice system demanded accountability. Neither offered mercy, and both defined him by his past. The present felt like a narrow bridge suspended over consequences. As the pressure mounted, the emotional toll became impossible to ignore. Stress manifested in subtle ways: restless nights, strained relationships, constant mental fatigue. The armor he wore so carefully began to crack. Strength in the Mafia was never about vulnerability, but vulnerability was becoming unavoidable. He began to see his father differently, not as a symbol of power, but as a man consumed by the role he played. John Gotti thrived on visibility, confidence, and dominance. John Jr., by contrast, survived through restraint. Their paths diverged not by choice, but by era. The realization was sobering. The qualities that once defined greatness and organized crime were now liabilities. Charisma attracted attention. Authority invited scrutiny. Silence, once sacred, was no longer enough. The rules had changed completely. John Jr. recognized that survival required adaptation beyond the streets. It required emotional distance from the identity he inherited. That process was painful, slow, and deeply personal. Letting go of expectation felt like betraying history, but holding on meant destruction. The decision to step further away became less about safety and more about sanity. The life had taken everything it could: time, peace, trust. What remained was choice, limited, constrained, but still present. As he reduced his presence, the myth surrounding the Gotti name began to fade. Not disappear, but soften. Without spectacle, there was less fear. Without fear, there was less obsession. It was not victory or defeat, it was erosion. And in that erosion, John Jr. found something unexpected: quiet. Not peace, but quiet. A space where thoughts could exist without immediate threat. Where days passed without constant anticipation of conflict. It was fragile, temporary, but real. Still, the past remained close. Court dates loomed. Investigations lingered. The story was far from over. Stepping back did not erase history, it only changed direction. The consequences of legacy could not be outrun, only faced differently. As time moved forward, John Gotti Jr. stood at a crossroads few mob heirs ever reached. One path led deeper into a shrinking world defined by paranoia and loss. The other led into uncertainty, stripped of power but open to survival. And as the city continued its endless motion, indifferent to names once feared, the question remained, unresolved: not whether he could escape the legacy, but what price escape would demand. Quiet did not mean safety for John Gotti Jr. It simply meant the noise had changed. Where gunshots and shouting once defined danger, now it was paperwork, subpoenas, and carefully worded indictments. The modern battlefield was invisible, and it rewarded patience over bravado. John Jr. learned that silence could still be loud when it echoed inside courtrooms. The legal pressure intensified in ways that felt relentless but impersonal. Prosecutors presented cases not as dramatic confrontations, but as long narratives, built from fragments, phone records, testimony, financial trails. Each detail alone seemed harmless, but together they painted a picture authorities were determined to finalize. John Jr. understood the strategy. They didn't need certainty, they needed momentum. Days blurred into routines defined by preparation and restraint. Lawyers spoke in probabilities rather than promises. Every option carried risk. Cooperation was suggested indirectly, never demanded outright, but the implication lingered in the air. The justice system had learned to wait men out, to exhaust them until resistance softened. For John Jr., the pressure was psychological as much as legal. The constant anticipation of consequences weighed heavier than any single charge. Freedom became conditional, measured in court dates and compliance rather than choice. Even when walking city streets, the feeling of being observed never fully faded. As legal battles progressed, something unexpected happened within the underworld. The absence of strong, centralized leadership accelerated fragmentation. Without a dominant figure, internal conflict surfaced more frequently. Disputes once settled quietly now risked exposure. The very survival strategies John Jr. adopted: distance, restraint, invisibility, created a vacuum others rushed to fill. Some filled it recklessly. Violence increased in unpredictable ways, drawing attention no one wanted. John Jr. watched from a distance, aware that involvement would only entangle him further. He had reached a point where intervention meant self-destruction. The empire he inherited was unraveling not through attack, but through neglect and evolution. This realization carried a strange sense of clarity. Power, he saw, was no longer sustainable in its old form. The systems that once protected crime families had collapsed under modern scrutiny. Surveillance was constant. Data was permanent. Mistakes lived forever. He thought often about his father during this time, not with resentment, but with understanding. John Gotti ruled in an era where confidence could intimidate institutions and loyalty could outlast investigation. That world no longer existed. What once looked like strength would now be evidence. John Jr. began to see his own restraint, not as failure, but adaptation. Survival meant evolving beyond the myths of the past. It meant accepting that legacy could not be preserved. It could only be survived. The legal system pressed harder. And eventually the moment arrived where endurance was no longer enough. Faced with the possibility of endless trials and escalating consequence, John Jr. made a decision rooted in pragmatism rather than pride. It was not dramatic. It was calculated, careful, and deeply personal. The choice altered how the world viewed him. To some, it confirmed long-held suspicions. To others, it represented the final collapse of an era. The Mafia code had always valued silence above all else, and breaking from expectation even without betrayal reshaped his identity permanently. But the identity had already been shifting. Public perception shifted as well. The image of the untouchable mob heir faded, replaced by something more complex and less sensational. Headlines softened. Interest waned. Without spectacle, the myth lost its power. The Gotti name no longer dominated conversation the way it once had. This fading was both relief and loss. For the first time, John Jr. experienced moments that felt almost ordinary. Time passed without immediate crisis. Days were no longer consumed entirely by strategy. There was space to reflect, to acknowledge exhaustion, to confront emotions long buried beneath obligation. Yet peace remained elusive. The past did not release its grip easily. Memory resurfaced, faces of men lost to prison or betrayal, moments where different choices might have led elsewhere. Reflection brought understanding, but also regret. Legacy, he learned, was not just inherited, it was endured. The underworld continued its transformation without him. New figures rose, motivated by profit rather than tradition. The old codes eroded further. What remained bore little resemblance to the structure his father once commanded. Watching from the outside, John Jr. recognized how narrow the line between relevance and ruin had become. The city itself seemed indifferent. New York moved forward, relentless and evolving. Neighborhoods changed. Generations passed. The streets that once whispered his family's name now echoed with different stories. Time, the most powerful force of all, erased what fear could not. In this new reality, John Jr. confronted the challenge of redefining purpose. Without authority, without expectation, life demanded a different kind of strength. It required accountability to self rather than system. The skills that once ensured survival, observation, discipline, restraint now served a different goal: stability. He did not seek redemption in grand gestures. There were no public apologies or dramatic exits. His transformation was quiet, internal, and gradual. The absence of spectacle was intentional. Attention had always been the enemy. As years passed, the legend of the Gotti dynasty settled into history rather than headlines. Stories remained, retold in documentaries and conversations, but they no longer shaped the present. The dangers shifted from immediate to symbolic. For John Jr., that shift marked survival. Still, the question of identity lingered. Who was he without the shadow, without the fear others projected onto his name? The answer was not simple, and perhaps never fully formed. But uncertainty was preferable to inevitability. The journey away from power did not erase consequences. It changed how they were faced. Acceptance replaced resistance. Adaptation replaced dominance. And in that transformation, John Gotti Jr. became something rare. In his world, a man who outlived the role he was born into. The story was not finished. The past still whispered, and the future remained unwritten. But the direction had changed. And with it, the meaning of legacy itself. Time did not heal everything for John Gotti Jr., but it did change the shape of his days. The sharp edges of constant danger softened into something duller, more manageable, yet always present. Life after influence was not empty. It was simply quieter, stripped of urgency and spectacle. In that quiet, John Jr. began to understand the true cost of the world he had survived. The transition was not immediate. For a long time he lived with one foot still planted in the past. Old habits lingered. Awareness never fully relaxed. He still noticed patterns, faces, pauses in conversation. Years of vigilance could not be undone easily. The instinct to calculate risk had become part of his nature. But something fundamental had shifted. He was no longer responding to constant external pressure from the underworld. There were no expectations to resolve disputes, no obligations to assert authority. The absence of responsibility felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable at first. Power, even when burdensome, provided structure. Without it, days felt unshaped. John Jr. began filling that space with reflection rather than reaction. He revisited memories not to relive them but to understand them. Moments from childhood surfaced with new clarity. Conversations that once seemed ordinary now revealed hidden meaning. He recognized how early his identity had been molded by silence, loyalty, and fear. Growing up, as the son of John Gotti, had shaped every aspect of his worldview. Strength was never discussed, it was demonstrated. Weakness was never named, it was avoided. Emotion was controlled, measured, and often concealed. These lessons had served him well in survival, but they had also narrowed his emotional range. As he distanced himself further from the life, John Jr. confronted emotions he had long suppressed. Guilt surfaced not only for actions taken, but for paths accepted without question. He thought about the people affected indirectly by the legacy he carried. Families disrupted, trust broken, lives altered quietly, without headlines. The process was uncomfortable. Accountability without a courtroom was harder than any trial. There were no verdicts, no clear endings, just acknowledgement. Public curiosity around his name faded gradually. New scandals replaced old ones. Attention shifted to different figures, different stories. For the first time since childhood, anonymity felt within reach. It was not complete, but it was enough to breathe. With distance came a clearer understanding of the Mafia's decline. Organized crime had not vanished, but it had transformed into something less centralized and less personal. The era of recognizable bosses had ended, replaced by fragmented networks driven by efficiency rather than loyalty. The codes that once governed behavior had dissolved under pressure from technology and relentless enforcement. John Jr. realized that his survival was not an accident. It was a product of timing and restraint. Many who clung to the old ways had paid with decades behind bars or worse. He had adapted just enough to step aside before the collapse became total. That realization brought neither pride nor relief, only acceptance. He began focusing on building a life that did not depend on fear or reputation. This required patience. Trust, once broken by association alone, took time to rebuild. Conversations outside the shadow of his past felt different, simpler, but also more honest. There was no need for coded language or guarded silence. Still, the name followed him. Introductions carried pauses. Questions lingered unasked. People recognized it, even when they pretended not to. John Jr. learned to live with that awareness, without letting it define interaction. He did not correct assumptions, nor did he feed them. Neutrality became his shield. In moments of solitude, he considered what legacy truly meant. His father's legacy had been power, visibility, and defiance. His own, he realized, might be restraint. Survival without domination. Ending a story without spectacle. This interpretation of legacy felt almost rebellious in its own way. In a culture that valued strength through force, choosing quiet endurance was an act of resistance. He also recognized the limits of redemption. No matter how far he stepped away, the past would always exist. History did not rewrite itself. The goal was not erasure, but coexistence, living alongside memory without being consumed by it. The world outside continued to change rapidly. Technology accelerated life. Social values shifted. Younger generations viewed organized crime as mythology rather than threat. The fear that once commanded obedience had lost relevance. John Jr. observed this shift with detachment, understanding that time had finally overtaken the world he inherited. There were moments of loss, friends unreachable, paths permanently closed. Some outcomes could never be undone. Acceptance meant acknowledging those losses without trying to justify them. Responsibility did not disappear with distance. Yet there were also moments of clarity. Freedom, he learned, was not dramatic. It was subtle. It existed in ordinary choices: where to go, who to speak to, what future to imagine. These choices had once been constrained by obligation and surveillance. Now they existed, imperfect but real. As years passed, John Gotti Jr. became less a symbol and more a person. The transition was incomplete and ongoing, but meaningful nonetheless. He did not seek validation for survival, nor did he claim moral victory. He simply continued forward, aware of where he came from, and deliberate about where he stood. The story of his life no longer moved toward power or conflict. It moved toward balance. Not peace, but equilibrium. A life defined not by fear of consequences, but by acceptance of reality. And in that balance, the Gotti legacy found its final transformation, not as an empire, not as a warning, but as a reminder that even the most powerful names are ultimately shaped by time, choice, and restraint. Distance from the past did not mean forgetting it for John Gotti Jr. Instead, memory became something he carried more lightly, no longer a weapon, pointed at his future but a weight that reminded him where not to return. The rhythm of his days settled into something steady, shaped by routine rather than reaction. For a man raised in urgency, steadiness felt almost unnatural. He learned to value predictability. Mornings arrived without crisis. Evenings ended without whispered plans. The absence of constant calculation created space for something he had rarely known: choice without consequence looming overhead. Yet the mind, trained by years of pressure, took time to accept this new reality. Silence still demanded interpretation. Calm still felt temporary. Gradually that tension eased. John Jr. began to notice how much energy the old life had consumed. Every interaction had once required assessment: who could be trusted, who might be listening, who would benefit from silence. Outside that environment, conversations flowed differently. Words were not weighed for hidden meanings. Pauses did not signal danger. It was disorienting, but also revealing. He observed how ordinary lives unfolded without constant fear. People planned years ahead, not days. They invested emotionally without bracing for betrayal. They disagreed without threat. These behaviors, once foreign, slowly became familiar, not because he forgot his past, but because he chose not to live inside it. The process of reintegration was subtle. There were no announcements, no declarations of change. He did not seek to prove anything. Transformation, he discovered, was most authentic when it went unnoticed. The less attention drawn to it, the more real it became. Still, the legacy lingered. Occasionally, his name resurfaced in conversation or media, usually framed by nostalgia rather than urgency. The tone had changed. What once inspired fear now sparked curiosity. The Mafia era associated with his family had passed into history, studied rather than confronted. This shift confirmed what he had long suspected: relevance fades faster than reputation. He thought often about his father during this time, not with longing, but with perspective. John Gotti had thrived on control and attention, mastering the art of dominance in a system that rewarded it. John Jr.'s survival, by contrast, depended on restraint and invisibility. Their paths reflected not difference in character, but difference in time. Understanding this helped release lingering guilt. He stopped measuring himself against expectations forged in another era. The standards that defined success for his father no longer applied. The world had moved on, and so had he. As years accumulated, John Jr. developed a quiet respect for time itself. Time exposed illusions, time softened extremes. Time revealed which fears were justified and which were inherited. It also showed that consequences, while unavoidable, were not always fatal. Many were simply endured. The underworld continued to evolve without him. Fragmentation accelerated. Loyalty became transactional. The romanticized codes dissolved into practicality. Watching from a distance confirmed his decision to step away. The world he left behind was no longer the one he knew, and returning would have required becoming someone he no longer was. He focused instead on stability. Stability did not mean comfort, it meant sustainability, living within limits, avoiding unnecessary risk, choosing environments where the past did not dominate the present. These choices were deliberate and sometimes isolating, but they provided something invaluable: continuity. There were moments of reflection that bordered on regret, but regret no longer controlled him. He acknowledged the paths taken, and those closed forever. Some losses could not be reclaimed. Acceptance did not excuse them. It contextualized them. Responsibility was carried, not denied. In quieter moments, John Jr. considered how legacy truly ends. Not with arrests or headlines, but with irrelevance. When fear dissolves into memory, power dissolves with it. This understanding did not feel tragic. It felt natural. Everything eventually yields to time. He recognized that his greatest act of defiance against the life he inherited was persistence without dominance, existing without exerting control, choosing to live rather than rule. This form of resistance was invisible, but effective. Relationships outside the shadow of crime developed slowly. Trust was built through consistency rather than reputation. People learned who he was now, not who he had been associated with. These relationships lacked intensity, but they offered something deeper: normalcy. Normalcy, he realized, was the rarest luxury of all. The constant vigilance that once defined his existence became background noise rather than command. He still noticed patterns, still assessed environments instinctively, but these instincts no longer dictated action. Awareness became a tool rather than a burden. As the years continued, John Gotti Jr. became less a symbol of transition and more an example of adaptation, not celebrated, not condemned, simply present. His story no longer unfolded through conflict, but through continuity. The city changed around him, as cities always do. Buildings rose and fell. Neighborhoods transformed. Generations replaced one another. The streets that once echoed with whispered names now carried different ambitions. The world moved forward, indifferent to legacy. In that indifference, John Jr. found freedom. Not the freedom of power, but the freedom of limitation. Knowing what he would not return to. Knowing what no longer defined him. Knowing that survival did not require dominance. The life he built was quieter than the one he left, but it was his. It was shaped by choice rather than inheritance. And in that choice, the weight of legacy finally loosened, not because it vanished, but because it no longer dictated direction. The story continued, not as a rise or fall, but as a steady line forward. And sometimes, that was the most radical ending of all. By the time the world fully accepted that John Gotti Jr. was no longer a central figure in organized crime, he had already learned something essential. Disappearance did not require escape, only consistency. Remaining outside the spotlight demanded discipline equal to any rule he had once followed. It was not enough to step away once. Distance had to be maintained daily, quietly, without exception. This discipline reshaped how he approached life. Every decision was filtered through a new standard. Does this preserve stability or threaten it? The measure was simple, but strict. Invitations were declined, familiar paths were avoided, situations that invited attention were left unexplored. The instincts that once protected power now protected peace. He noticed how easily people confused absence with weakness. In the underworld, stepping back was often interpreted as surrender. But John Jr. understood the deeper truth. Restraint required strength. It took far more control to remain uninvolved than to assert authority. Silence, once enforced, had become intentional. The emotional residue of the past did not vanish. Certain sounds, places, or moments triggered memories without warning. A passing conversation in a restaurant. A glance held too long. A pause before a door opened. These moments reminded him that experience never fully dissolves, it integrates. Yet these reminders no longer dictated behavior. He acknowledged them and moved forward. Mastery over reaction replaced mastery over others. This internal shift marked the most profound transformation of all. He became increasingly aware of how narratives outlive individuals. Stories about his family continued circulating, shaped by exaggeration and distance. The truth existed somewhere between myth and memory, but he no longer felt compelled to correct it. The stories belonged to the past, and the past no longer belonged to him. Occasionally, he encountered individuals who saw him only through that narrative. Their curiosity carried caution, fascination, or judgment. John Jr. responded with neutrality. He neither confirmed nor denied expectation. He understood that people often see what they want to see, and correction rarely changes perception. This acceptance brought unexpected calm. Without the burden of defending identity, he focused on living within reality rather than reputation. His days were not remarkable, but they were stable. Stability, he learned, was earned through repetition. Every uneventful day reinforced the life he had chosen. Time continued to reshape the meaning of legacy. The Mafia, once feared as an unstoppable force, now existed more as a historical concept than an immediate threat. Its influence persisted in pockets, but the era of dominance had passed. The systems that supported it had been dismantled piece by piece through patience and persistence. John Jr. reflected on how different outcomes might have been had he resisted change. The men who clung to the past often paid the highest price. Their loyalty became leverage against them. Their refusal to adapt ensured their disappearance not into anonymity, but into prison systems that erased individuality. Adaptation, he realized, was not betrayal. It was recognition of reality. He began to appreciate the role of anonymity. Without the pressure to perform or lead, he experienced moments of genuine presence. Simple routines gained meaning. The absence of conflict allowed attention to shift inward. The world slowed to a pace where observation replaced anticipation. The memory of his father surfaced often during these reflections. John Gotti had lived loudly, embracing visibility and confrontation. His confidence shaped an era, but it also sealed his fate. John Jr. did not judge those choices. He contextualized them. Different times demanded different strategies. Understanding this distinction helped him reconcile the tension between loyalty and survival. He honored his father not by imitation, but by evolution. Preserving life rather than image became the truest form of respect. As years passed, the public appetite for gangster mythology waned. New generations lacked emotional connection to figures who once dominated headlines. Organized crime lost its cultural hold, replaced by different fears and fascinations. The Gotti name remained known, but its power diminished to reference rather than presence. This shift reinforced a truth John Jr. had lived quietly for years. Influence is temporary, but consequence endures. What mattered now was not what had been controlled, but what remained. He cultivated patience with himself. Growth did not follow a linear path. Some days felt heavier than others. Certain memories resisted reinterpretation. But resilience was no longer about dominance. It was about endurance without bitterness. The distance he maintained from the past also allowed empathy to emerge. He saw how systems shaped behavior, how environment limited choice, how expectations inherited at birth could determine trajectory. This understanding did not excuse actions, but it deepened awareness. With that awareness came a quieter sense of responsibility, not to lead, but to avoid repeating cycles. His existence outside the life became a statement, even without words. It demonstrated that survival did not require perpetuation. The city around him continued to evolve, indifferent to history. New stories unfolded on streets once associated with fear. The present replaced the past without ceremony. John Jr. watched this progression without resentment. Time had done what violence could not. It had moved on. In that movement he found his place, not at the center, not on the edge, but within the flow. His life no longer demanded attention. It required only intention. And so, the story continued not with a climax, but with continuity. A man born into power choosing persistence over prominence. A legacy transformed not through confrontation, but through absence. In the end, the most enduring mark John Gotti Jr. made on the world was not the influence he inherited, but the influence he refused to exert. As the years unfolded, John Gotti Jr. discovered that distance from power required a different kind of courage than the one he had learned growing up. Courage was no longer measured by confrontation or dominance, but by restraint and patience. The discipline to remain ordinary, to avoid gravity pulling him back toward the past, demanded consistency that never wavered. He became increasingly aware of how easily old patterns could reassert themselves. Familiar voices resurfaced from time to time, carrying nostalgia disguised as opportunity. Conversations hinted at unfinished business, at loyalty remembered, at respect owed. John Jr. listened without commitment. He understood that the past often returned wearing new language. Each refusal reinforced the boundary he had drawn. Boundaries, he learned, were not declarations, they were habits. Saying no once meant little. Saying no every time reshaped reality. Over time, the invitations faded. The calls stopped. Silence returned, this time without tension. With that silence came space to examine the cost of legacy beyond legal consequence. He thought about the emotional inheritance passed down through generations, how fear disguised itself as strength, how loyalty demanded silence, how identity was bound to expectation. These lessons had been taught implicitly, reinforced daily, never questioned. Stepping outside that framework allowed him to see it clearly for the first time. He recognized how deeply those rules had shaped his instincts. Even in calm moments, vigilance remained. Even in safety, caution lingered. The body remembered what the mind sought to release. Healing, he realized, was not forgetting, it was learning to respond differently to memory. John Jr. practiced that response deliberately. When anxiety surfaced without cause, he acknowledged it rather than reacting. When suspicion appeared, he questioned its origin. Slowly, the past loosened its hold. Not entirely, but enough to breathe. The world beyond the underworld proved more complex than he once imagined. Without the clarity of enemies and allies, life presented ambiguity. People acted out of self-interest without malice. Conflicts existed without threats. Resolution required communication rather than intimidation. These dynamics were unfamiliar but enlightening. He learned that power was not the only way to influence outcomes. Patience, consistency, and presence carried weight of their own. Influence could be subtle, even invisible. It could exist without fear. This understanding reframed how he viewed his father's legacy. John Gotti had embodied an era where visibility equaled control. His confidence filled rooms, shaped narratives, and commanded attention. John Jr.'s era offered no such reward. Visibility now invited collapse. Control attracted scrutiny. The tools that once built empires now dismantled them. Accepting this difference allowed John Jr. to let go of comparison. He was not meant to replicate his father's path. Survival required divergence. Legacy, in this sense, was not a script, it was a challenge to be reinterpreted. He became more comfortable with the idea that his story might never feel complete. There would be no definitive ending, no final resolution that tied every thread neatly together. Some questions would remain unanswered. Some judgments would persist. Acceptance meant living without closure. As he settled into this perspective, time softened even the sharpest memories. Events that once felt immediate became distant, stripped of urgency. The emotional charge diminished. Reflection replaced reaction. Experience transformed into understanding. The city around him continued its relentless evolution. Neighborhoods changed identities. New voices replaced old ones. The cultural memory of organized crime faded further into abstraction. For many, it became entertainment rather than threat. This shift confirmed what John Jr. had sensed for years. Relevance was not permanent. He observed younger generations navigating a world shaped by different fears and ambitions. Their challenges were technological, economic, global. The street-level power structures that once dominated no longer held the same sway. The future belonged to different systems entirely. This realization brought unexpected relief. The pressure to represent or preserve something outdated dissolved. John Jr. no longer felt responsible for an era that had ended. His role was not to carry it forward, but to let it rest. Occasionally, moments of doubt surfaced. What if stepping away had been interpreted incorrectly? What if silence was mistaken for guilt? These questions appeared briefly, then passed. He had learned that control over perception was impossible. Peace required releasing that desire. He focused instead on intention, acting with clarity, living within limits, choosing environments that supported stability. These choices accumulated into a life defined by consistency rather than conflict. The absence of chaos allowed deeper self-awareness. He recognized strengths developed under pressure, discipline, observation, endurance. He also recognized costs, emotional distance, guarded trust, lingering vigilance. Both were part of the same inheritance. Acknowledging both allowed integration. He no longer rejected his past nor surrendered to it. He carried it as experience rather than identity. As seasons changed, the world's attention shifted again and again. Headlines moved on. Stories aged. Names lost urgency. John Jr. watched this progression without attachment. Time had accomplished what resistance could not. In that progression, he found quiet purpose, not to teach lessons publicly or rewrite narratives, but to live in a way that did not perpetuate harm, to exist without feeding cycles of fear or dominance, to demonstrate, simply by example, that withdrawal was possible. This choice did not redeem the past, but it altered the future. It prevented repetition. It closed a chapter without ceremony. And so, the story continued in its most understated form. A man once defined by proximity to power, now defined by distance from it. A legacy transformed not by victory or defeat, but by endurance. In the stillness of that endurance, John Gotti Jr. discovered something. The underworld had never offered him control over his own direction. With time came a deeper awareness for John Gotti Jr. that the absence of conflict did not mean the absence of consequence. The world he had stepped away from still existed, though it no longer revolved around him. Its echoes surfaced occasionally in unexpected ways: an old name mentioned in passing, a memory triggered by a familiar street, a news story that mirrored patterns he recognized instantly. These moments reminded him that history never fully recedes. It waits quietly, reshaped by distance. He had learned to meet those moments without reaction. Where once instinct demanded readiness, now reflection guided response. This shift was neither accidental nor easy. It was practiced, repeated, and reinforced through countless ordinary days. The discipline that once enforced silence had been repurposed to sustain balance. Balance became the central goal. Without the sharp edges of power, life revealed subtleties he had never noticed. Time stretched differently. Decisions were no longer urgent. Consequences unfolded slowly, allowing space for correction. This space felt foreign at first, but it gradually became grounding. The absence of constant threat allowed him to experience continuity, days connected by routine rather than crisis. He began to understand how deeply crisis had shaped his perception of normal. In the past, calm had been temporary, a pause between confrontations. Now calm was the baseline. It redefined what strength meant. Strength was no longer measured by dominance, but by stability maintained over time. John Jr. recognized that stability demanded accountability of a different kind. There was no hierarchy to enforce discipline, no code to justify action. Responsibility rested entirely with him. This autonomy was both liberating and demanding. Without external rules, values had to be chosen consciously. He chose restraint. He chose consistency. He chose a future that did not depend on fear. These choices gradually altered how he viewed the concept of loyalty. Loyalty had once meant silence and sacrifice without question. Now it meant honesty and boundaries. Loyalty to self required saying no, even when nostalgia tempted yes. It required resisting the pull of familiarity when familiarity led backward. Occasionally, he considered the many paths his life might have taken. Each reflection ended the same way. Speculation changed nothing. What mattered was the present trajectory. Dwelling on alternate outcomes only distracted from the reality he had built. The world beyond organized crime revealed complexities he had never been allowed to explore. Relationships were negotiated rather than enforced. Disagreements resolved through dialogue rather than intimidation. Influence earned through trust rather than fear. These dynamics required vulnerability, something the old life had discouraged. Learning vulnerability took time. John Jr. discovered that vulnerability did not weaken him, it clarified him. Acknowledging uncertainty allowed growth. Admitting limits preserved stability. The lessons were quiet, cumulative, and transformative. He thought again of his father, John Gotti, not as an icon, but as a product of his time. The elder Gotti's rise and fall reflected an era where spectacle commanded attention and defiance inspired loyalty. That era rewarded boldness, even recklessness. John Jr.'s era punished it. Understanding this difference allowed compassion without imitation. He honored the past by refusing to repeat it. That refusal became his most consistent act of independence. As public memory shifted, the story of the Gotti name settled into history. Documentaries, books, and conversations reframed it as a closed chapter. Curiosity replaced fear. Analysis replaced urgency. For John Jr., this reframing reduced the pressure of representation. The name no longer demanded performance. He did not correct the record or seek to control narrative. He accepted that stories evolve without permission. His focus remained on living quietly within his own reality. That reality valued continuity over recognition. The city continued its relentless transformation. New generations walked streets once marked by invisible lines of influence. The past existed beneath their feet, unseen and irrelevant. John Jr. watched this with a sense of completion. The world had moved on without needing closure. Completion did not mean erasure, it meant integration. The experiences that once defined him now informed him. They sharpened perception without dictating behavior. They reminded him of limits without imposing fear. Experience became reference rather than restraint. As the years advanced, he noticed how the absence of chaos allowed attention to shift outward. He became more observant of others' struggles, more patient with uncertainty. Empathy grew where suspicion once lived. The contrast revealed how fear narrows perspective and how safety expands it. He did not romanticize his past, nor did he condemn it endlessly. He understood it as a chapter written under conditions that no longer applied. Judgment softened into understanding. Understanding did not excuse, but it contextualized. In moments of solitude, he considered what he would leave behind. Not wealth, not power, not legend. Perhaps something quieter, a demonstration that withdrawal was possible, that cycles could end without violence. That survival did not require dominance. This legacy, he realized, would never be celebrated. It would likely go unnoticed. But that invisibility was its strength. It did not invite imitation or competition. It simply existed. The days continued, unremarkable by design. Stability accumulated. Habits reinforced direction. The future remained open, defined by intention rather than inheritance. And so, the story advanced not toward resolution, but toward permanence. A life shaped by choice, maintained through restraint, and freed from the demands of a world that no longer existed. In that permanence, John Gotti Jr. found what the underworld had never offered him: not power, but peace sustained by discipline. As the years settled into a steady rhythm, John Gotti Jr. came to understand that survival was not a destination but a practice. It required daily attention, quiet decisions, and the willingness to accept limits without resentment. The life he had built demanded less drama but more discipline, less excitement but greater awareness. In this exchange, he found something lasting. He noticed how habits defined identity more reliably than reputation ever had. Small, repeated choices shaped days, and days shaped years. There was comfort in this predictability. The uncertainty that once defined his existence had been replaced by routine, not monotony, but continuity. Continuity allowed reflection without fear. Reflection revealed how much of his earlier life had been governed by reaction. Every move had once been a response to threat or expectation. Now action preceded reaction. He chose where to be, whom to trust, and how to spend time. The difference was subtle but profound. He began to appreciate the value of limits. In the past, limits were imposed by force or surveillance. Now they were self-chosen. He avoided environments that invited chaos. He declined opportunities that promised attention. He prioritized spaces where anonymity was preserved. These boundaries protected the balance he had earned. Balance required vigilance of a different kind. There were no enemies to anticipate, but there were temptations to manage. Nostalgia could be dangerous. It softened memories, reframed risk as familiarity. John Jr. recognized nostalgia as a test rather than a comfort. When it surfaced, he acknowledged it and moved forward. The underworld still whispered from a distance, but its voice had lost urgency. The figures who once commanded respect were gone or irrelevant. New names emerged, but they did not command the same gravity. The structure that once made organized crime formidable had dissolved into fragments. Efficiency replaced loyalty. Speed replaced patience. Watching this evolution confirmed his decision to step away. The life he had known no longer existed. What remained bore little resemblance to the codes and hierarchies of his youth. Returning would not have meant reclaiming a role. It would have meant entering chaos without protection. He reflected again on the contrast between generations. His father, John Gotti, had lived in a time when charisma could shield against consequence, at least temporarily. Confidence projected power, and power commanded silence. That equation had collapsed. Confidence now attracted scrutiny. Silence invited suspicion. The rules had inverted. Understanding this inversion allowed John Jr. to release lingering comparisons. He was not less for choosing restraint. He was adapted to reality. Adaptation, he learned, was the most reliable form of intelligence. As public interest continued to fade, he experienced something rare, time unclaimed by narrative. There was no expectation to explain or perform. He existed without being interpreted. This anonymity was fragile, but precious. It allowed him to live without constantly negotiating perception. He became more selective with attention. He listened carefully, spoke sparingly, and avoided unnecessary exposure. These habits were not born of fear but intention. He valued privacy as a form of stability. Privacy allowed mistakes without consequence and growth without scrutiny. Growth came slowly and without ceremony. He learned patience with himself. Old reflexes resurfaced, occasionally guarded instincts, quick assessments, but they no longer dominated. Awareness became observational rather than reactive. The body relaxed into the present. He also learned to accept ambiguity. Not every question required an answer. Not every memory demanded interpretation. Some things simply existed as they were. Acceptance reduced the need for control, and with it, the residual tension of the past. The city continued to transform around him. Economic shifts, cultural changes, and new technologies reshaped daily life. The structures that once supported organized crime struggled to survive in this environment. Transparency replaced secrecy. Data replaced rumor. The future belonged to systems incompatible with old methods. John Jr. recognized that his survival was intertwined with this transformation. He had stepped away at a moment when departure was still possible. Others who delayed found themselves trapped by systems that no longer forgave error. Timing mattered as much as intention. He considered the notion of legacy again, this time with greater clarity. Legacy was not what endured publicly, it was what ceased privately. Ending a cycle did not require acknowledgement. It required consistency. He had ended his involvement not with a declaration, but with sustained absence. That absence reshaped his relationship with the past. Memories lost their sharpness. The urgency faded. What remained were lessons rather than wounds. Experience transformed into perspective. Perspective allowed empathy for others still trapped by expectation, for those who mistook familiarity for safety, for those who believed power could outpace consequence. He did not judge them. He understood them. Understanding did not draw him back. It confirmed his distance. He also understood that peace was not permanent. It required maintenance. Complacency invited regression. He remained attentive without being anxious. He protected stability without clinging to it. Balance was dynamic, not static. As time continued its quiet work, John Gotti Jr. became increasingly comfortable with an unresolved ending. There was no final statement to make, no redemption arc to complete. Life unfolded without narrative symmetry, and that was acceptable. He lived with the awareness that some stories were meant to fade rather than conclude. The fading itself was the conclusion. In that fading, he found a form of freedom that power had never offered. Freedom from expectation. Freedom from reaction. Freedom from the need to prove endurance through dominance. The days passed, connected by intention. The future remained open, unclaimed by inheritance. And in that openness, the legacy he carried finally transformed not into a monument, but into a quiet, sustained refusal to repeat the past. As the years stretched on, John Gotti Jr. began to grasp the full weight of what it meant to live quietly in the shadow of notoriety. The life he had inherited was not a series of discrete events, but an accumulation of consequence, expectation, and constant calculation. Stepping away had not removed the past. It had only changed the terms by which it influenced him. He had moved from active participant to observer, and that role required a subtler kind of intelligence, an intelligence he had been forced to cultivate through years of experience. The first challenge of this transition was perception. People assumed that detachment implied weakness. They interpreted distance as defeat. John Jr. knew otherwise. Restraint demanded far more discipline than action ever had. Each decision to remain uninvolved, each refusal to respond to provocation, required a conscious commitment. It was a daily exercise in patience, strategy, and self-awareness. He observed carefully, noting patterns that would have once dictated immediate reaction. Conversations with acquaintances carried subtle cues. The rhythms of the city offered indirect intelligence. Past instincts were repurposed not to control, but to understand. Knowledge remained valuable, even when it no longer granted power. In these years, John Jr. also began to recognize the limits of influence. He could no longer shape events directly. Attempts to intervene were risky and often unnecessary. The world had evolved beyond the frameworks that had once enabled dominance. Structures of power were decentralized, fleeting, and less personal. Control was no longer feasible. Preservation was the priority. This realization reshaped his approach to relationships. Alliances once formed through fear or expectation were replaced with connections built on mutual understanding and cautious respect. Trust became earned over time rather than assumed by proximity. John Jr. approached these relationships with patience, aware that history could not be undone but could be navigated more deliberately. Emotional intelligence became as critical as streetwise acumen. Situations that would have once demanded immediate strategic maneuvering now required reflection, empathy, and measured response. He learned to sit with tension without dissolving into it. Awareness, not action, became the currency of survival. During this period, John Jr. revisited many memories of his youth with clarity he had not previously possessed. He thought about the streets that had once defined him, the voices that had shaped him, and the choices that had carried consequences beyond his comprehension at the time. Reflection revealed layers of cause and effect he had never fully appreciated. He began to see how inherited behavior, environment, and expectation had intertwined to shape outcomes. Understanding this complexity offered both comfort and challenge. Comfort, because it illuminated why he had acted as he did. Challenge, because it revealed the extent to which he had been constrained by forces outside his control. Reconciliation required acknowledging responsibility while resisting self-condemnation. In the background of these reflections, the city moved relentlessly forward. Neighborhoods shifted, businesses emerged, and new generations occupied spaces once familiar to him. The world he had known dynamic, intense, and perilous had softened in ways he could observe without participation. Fear had faded as a societal mechanism. Curiosity replaced respect. The streets were no longer ruled by invisible hierarchies, but by transient ambition. John Jr. also came to understand the subtleties of perception. The name he carried still drew attention, but the nature of that attention had changed. Where once it inspired fear or admiration, it now elicited fascination, speculation, or distant recognition. This shift allowed him to navigate the world with less pretense and more authenticity. He did not need to perform. He did not need to defend. He simply existed. In practical terms, his daily life became defined by choices that supported consistency and balance. Routine became a tool for stability. Decisions about where to go, whom to engage, and how to respond were guided by principles rather than pressure. Each deliberate choice reinforced the larger structure of his life. The quiet repetition of these choices accumulated into a life that was self-directed and resilient. At the same time, he maintained awareness of the past, not as a burden but as context. He knew that old threats could resurface unexpectedly, that misperceptions could follow him indefinitely, and that reputation, once earned, could persist long after circumstances had changed. Vigilance remained necessary, though its form had evolved. He no longer reacted reflexively but maintained readiness in a measured, controlled way. John Jr. also spent time considering the notion of legacy in a new light. Legacy was no longer about prominence, fear, or public memory. It was about sustainability, endurance, and the quiet refusal to repeat destructive patterns. The Gotti name had once signified power enforced through spectacle and intimidation. Now he sought to demonstrate a different kind of strength, one that relied on discipline, discretion, and adaptation. He began to embrace the subtle forms of influence that persisted outside of public perception. Guidance offered quietly, support extended without fanfare, and lessons absorbed without explicit acknowledgement. All became part of this evolving understanding. He recognized that leadership and impact did not require visibility, but rather consistency over time. The personal transformation required emotional fortitude. Old instincts of suspicion and guardedness remained deeply ingrained. John Jr. confronted them daily, choosing reflection over reaction. The mental effort was ongoing, subtle, and invisible to others, but it was critical to maintaining the life he had built. Emotional endurance replaced physical vigilance as the primary challenge. As the years continued, the pressure of the past began to diminish in its intensity. Public fascination waned. Cultural memory softened the edges of fear. The criminal structures that once demanded his attention had become less relevant. New systems governed social interaction, economic influence, and personal safety. The world had moved beyond the framework of the life he inherited, and he moved with it. In this space, John Jr. discovered the value of intentionality. Every action, every choice, every engagement was deliberate. Nothing was taken for granted. Presence became mindful rather than reactive. Silence became a tool for observation, reflection, and preservation. He no longer sought to control outcomes externally but cultivated internal equilibrium. Ultimately, this chapter of his life demonstrated a truth that had eluded him in youth. Power is not the measure of survival. Endurance, discretion, and adaptability are. The ability to live consistently, maintain boundaries, and navigate consequence without self-destruction proved more valuable than any reputation inherited at birth. Through quiet discipline and conscious restraint, John Gotti Jr. had transformed the inheritance of chaos into a practice of self-preservation. Survival was no longer a matter of dominance but of thoughtful engagement with the world, sustained over time. The life he led was unremarkable to outsiders but profound in its continuity. In that continuity, he found freedom, not freedom from the past, but freedom within it. He had neither sought nor required acknowledgement. His endurance was his own, shaped by choice and maintained through reflection. And in that, the legacy of the Gotti name found a new expression, one defined not by notoriety or power, but by the quiet, deliberate preservation of life itself. In the years that followed, John Gotti Jr. came to understand the subtle, almost imperceptible ways that freedom could be preserved once power was relinquished. The city no longer required him to assert control. It demanded only attention to nuance. He moved through life deliberately, measuring decisions not against reputation but against consequence. This was a different form of intelligence, one learned only by surviving the pressures of a past that refused to die quietly. The streets that had once defined him now seemed distant, almost fictional. Buildings rose and fell, neighborhoods evolved, and the rhythm of the city shifted beneath him. The urgency that had always dictated his day's threats, power struggles, obligations was replaced by deliberate observation. He noticed patterns invisible to most, small shifts in tone, subtle changes in behavior, the quiet signals of intent that went unnoticed by everyone else. His instincts, once honed for survival through confrontation, were now applied toward understanding rather than action. Even as he embraced this quieter life, the past retained a presence. Memories surfaced without warning: a familiar voice in a cafe, a name dropped in conversation, a shadow of his father in a gesture or expression. These moments reminded him that history never truly disappeared. It simply shifted in form. Where once it demanded reaction, now it required reflection. And reflection, he discovered, was just as demanding as response had once been. John Jr. recognized that living under the weight of legacy was both a burden and a teacher. He had been born into an era of spectacle and fear, and he had learned early that reputation was currency. But the absence of public expectation revealed a deeper lesson. Influence and survival are not synonymous. One could outlive fame, endure consequence, and remain intact without exerting dominance. This realization reshaped his understanding of control, power, and resilience. Relationships, too, evolved in this new landscape. The alliances of his youth, formed out of necessity, fear, and loyalty, were replaced by connections built on discretion and mutual respect. John Jr. approached interactions with a careful openness, aware that trust could be extended but had to be earned through consistency. Every engagement, however minor, carried weight, because stability relied on measured attention rather than reactive instinct. In this environment, emotional intelligence became as critical as vigilance had once been. He learned to navigate subtle tensions without assuming hostility, to recognize without acting on impulse, and to observe without judgment. These skills were cultivated quietly, reinforced over countless ordinary interactions, and became essential to maintaining a life free from unnecessary complication. As he matured, John Jr. also confronted the role of identity in his transformation. The name he carried, once feared, now observed with curiosity, remained a part of him, but it no longer dictated behavior. He did not need to defend, prove, or assert it. Instead, he explored what it meant to exist under its shell while living independently of it. This independence was neither rejection nor denial. It was an acknowledgement that legacy, like time, is continuous, mutable, and ultimately personal. The process of adjustment was not without difficulty. Old habits, deeply ingrained from years of vigilance and survival, surfaced in moments of stress. Suspicion, guardedness, and rapid judgment emerged instinctively, threatening the calm he had cultivated. But John Jr. met these instincts with reflection rather than reaction. He practiced patience with himself, understanding that adaptation was iterative, not instantaneous. Healing, he discovered, was less about erasing the past and more about integrating it thoughtfully into present choices. He also observed how culture around organized crime had shifted. The era that had defined his family's prominence had passed into history, transformed into folklore and entertainment. Young generations learned of the Mafia through dramatization rather than lived experience. This change underscored the impermanence of power. Influence fades, memory persists selectively, and consequence remains long after the spectacle has ended. In witnessing this shift, John Jr. developed an appreciation for the quiet forms of influence that persisted outside public perception. Lessons learned and applied, guidance offered without fanfare, stability maintained without attention, these became the hallmarks of his life. The act of survival itself, absent of spectacle, emerged as the most enduring statement he could make. He reflected on his father, John Gotti, often not with judgment but with perspective. The elder Gotti had operated in a world where visibility commanded loyalty and intimidation reinforced power. John Jr. had inherited a world transformed, where the tools of dominance attracted scrutiny rather than respect. Understanding this distinction allowed him to reconcile the difference in approach without resentment or envy. The city, meanwhile, continued its relentless transformation. Urban landscapes shifted, demographics evolved, and systems of governance and technology redefined opportunity and risk. John Jr. observed these changes without attachment, aware that his survival depended on adaptability rather than nostalgia. The world he inhabited demanded attention to detail, measured responses, and careful restraint. Through this lens, he understood that resilience was not dramatic. It existed in consistent practice, careful boundaries, and the patient accumulation of choices that preserved stability. The absence of chaos did not signify ease. It required vigilance of a subtler kind. Each day became a practice in sustaining continuity, balancing awareness with restraint, and maintaining distance from past structures without denial. Memory, reflection, and observation became the pillars of his existence. He acknowledged the emotional residue of a life once defined by visibility and confrontation, but he no longer allowed it to dictate action. Past experiences informed judgment without compelling action, allowing space for measured decision-making. Ultimately, John Jr. came to recognize that his legacy would not be measured in headlines or power, but in endurance. The life he had chosen, quiet, deliberate, and disciplined, demonstrated that survival was possible without perpetuating cycles of violence or spectacle. Legacy, he realized, is not always visible, and its most profound form often resides in the maintenance of equilibrium over time. In that quiet, steady practice, he found autonomy. Not freedom from history, but freedom within it. Each choice reinforced stability, each day strengthened resilience, and each moment of reflection cultivated understanding. Life was no longer a series of crises demanding response, but a continuum of choices demanding awareness. And in this continuum, John Gotti Jr. discovered the rarest form of mastery, the ability to endure, adapt, and exist beyond the expectations imposed by legacy or reputation. By this stage of life, John Gotti Jr. had come to understand the subtle power of invisibility. Having stepped away from the public eye and the underworld that once defined him, he realized that living without observation offered an opportunity for introspection, growth, and recalibration that no amount of authority or spectacle had ever allowed. The world that had once demanded immediate action, constant calculation, rigid loyalty now existed as a backdrop, a context rather than a controller. He moved through daily routines with quiet intentionality. Each decision where to go, what to say, whom to meet was informed not by fear, obligation, or expectation, but by consideration for long-term stability. In the absence of conflict, the smallest choices acquired profound significance. Consistency became a form of mastery, and repetition a tool for shaping reality without exerting power. This was the discipline of survival in a world where threats were less overt, but persistence remained essential. John Jr. observed the rhythm of the city around him with a clarity born of experience. Streets and neighborhoods evolved, businesses changed hands, people came and went, and cultural patterns shifted subtly yet inexorably. Where once every gesture, tone, and movement might have carried implicit threat or opportunity, now the environment offered nuances to study rather than immediate challenges to respond to. His mind, trained for vigilance, found new purpose in observation, for understanding rather than for strategy. Even as the past receded into memory, it continued to influence him. Certain moments, the echo of a familiar phrase, the sight of a particular building, the subtle cadence of a conversation triggered reflexive recognition. These reminders were neither welcomed nor shunned. They were acknowledged. Reflection replaced reaction. The lessons embedded in decades of experience shaped his perception, informing decisions without dictating them. In this space, he discovered a deeper appreciation for patience. Life no longer moved in crises, with consequences arriving immediately and sharply. Time now unfolded in layers, each day a continuation rather than a confrontation. This shift allowed him to perceive causality differently. Patterns emerged over weeks, months, and years rather than hours. Decision-making became an exercise in foresight, observation, and disciplined restraint. He also reconsidered relationships in this transformed landscape. Alliances once based on fear, obligation, or loyalty demanded of circumstance were replaced with connections built on consistency, discretion, and mutual respect. Trust was cultivated carefully and maintained through repeated demonstration rather than inherited expectation. John Jr. learned to navigate these social spaces with subtlety, understanding that influence no longer derived from reputation alone, but from the quiet reliability of presence. Through these relational dynamics, he discovered the importance of emotional intelligence, where the underworld demanded immediate dominance, negotiation through fear and manipulation of perception. His life now required insight, patience, and adaptability. He learned to recognize motives, anticipate outcomes, and interpret nuance without reacting impulsively. Awareness became a tool not for control but for harmony and self-preservation. The name he carried, once a beacon of notoriety, remained a shadow at the edge of perception. People recognized it with curiosity or apprehension, sometimes expecting behavior tied to myth rather than reality. John Jr. neither encouraged nor corrected these assumptions. Instead, he allowed them to exist without interference, maintaining autonomy over his actions and identity. Living under the weight of inherited notoriety required such detachment, a conscious refusal to allow reputation to dictate reality. He often reflected on his father, John Gotti, with tempered understanding. The elder Gotti had operated in a world of spectacle and visibility, where charisma, audacity, and defiance commanded loyalty and attention. John Jr. had inherited a world transformed, in which such attributes invited scrutiny rather than admiration. Recognizing this distinction enabled him to honor his father's life without imitation, crafting a path defined by discretion, patience, and long-term stability rather than dominance. Memory remained a teacher. John Jr. revisited past experiences not to relive them, but to extract understanding. He considered decisions made under duress, patterns of trust and betrayal, and moments of both success and misjudgment. These reflections were analytical, devoid of emotion-driven urgency, and served as guides for living in a context no longer defined by immediate threat. Time itself became a lens through which he interpreted survival. He recognized that endurance was measured not by confrontation but by continuity. The ability to exist, navigate consequence, and maintain stability over decades represent a form of mastery that was invisible to observers but deeply felt by the individual. This awareness reframed his sense of accomplishment and self-worth, anchoring identity in process rather than performance. John Jr. also observed the evolving social and economic landscape. The city had shifted from one where power was asserted through hierarchy and force to one dominated by decentralization, technology, and rapid mobility. Patterns of influence no longer adhered to the old rules. He understood that his previous strategies were incompatible with this new environment, and embracing this understanding was essential to maintaining freedom. The absence of external conflict allowed him to explore internal landscapes. He confronted residual fear, emotional guardedness, and ingrained suspicion with deliberate attention. These impulses, once critical for survival, were now examined and mitigated through reflection and mindfulness. He practiced patience with himself, accepting that adaptation was gradual and nonlinear. Legacy, in this matured perspective, assumed a different meaning. It was no longer tied to public recognition or fear, but to the ability to break cycles and preserve life. The quiet continuation of survival without perpetuating harm became its own form of enduring influence. By refusing to repeat destructive patterns, John Jr. cultivated a legacy that operated outside the public gaze, invisible yet profound. In this phase, he also cultivated an appreciation for the ordinary. Simple routines, consistent habits, and unremarkable days gained significance because they represented continuity. Freedom was expressed in the ability to live without expectation, to move through life unshaped by inherited urgency, and to engage with the world deliberately rather than reactively. In that normalcy, he discovered a depth of autonomy and peace that had been unattainable in earlier years. Ultimately, the transformation he experienced demonstrated that power and notoriety are transient, but discipline, adaptability, and resilience endure. The life he had chosen, quiet, intentional, and self-directed, represented mastery not of others, but of self. Survival became an art not of conquest, but of patient, reflective, and continuous practice. In this reflection, John Gotti Jr. realized the rarest form of control, the ability to exist beyond expectation, to navigate consequence without reaction, and to live fully in a reality he had shaped for himself. This form of mastery, invisible to the world, became the cornerstone of his legacy. It was not a legacy of spectacle or fear, but of endurance, adaptation, and quiet self-determination. By the time John Gotti Jr. had settled into a life removed from the glare of public attention and the constant pressures of the underworld, he began to comprehend the subtle dimensions of time itself. Time, he realized, was no longer a measure of urgency or survival, but a medium through which growth, reflection, and endurance could be cultivated. Every day, every hour, and every interaction had acquired layers of significance that were invisible yet profound. Life was no longer about responding to threat or asserting authority. It was about maintaining equilibrium, making deliberate choices, and preserving the fragile continuity of existence. He moved through the city with a practiced awareness, noticing details that would have once gone unnoticed. The rhythm of footsteps on pavement, the cadence of conversations in cafes, shifting patterns of light on buildings. Each element was a subtle reminder that the world was in constant flux, that power and influence were transient, and that survival depended on adaptability rather than domination. He observed without interference, allowing the environment to teach him lessons that no confrontation ever could. The shadows of the past remained present but had lost their urgency. Encounters with familiar names or locations sparked memories, but they no longer demanded immediate action. John Jr. had learned to respond with observation and reflection rather than instinctive reaction. The skills that had once protected him through chaos were now applied to understanding, assessment, and strategic patience. He recognized that knowledge and awareness could serve as tools of survival even when traditional forms of power were absent. Relationships became exercises in careful management and subtle navigation. The alliances forged in youth through loyalty, obligation, or fear had long since dissolved, leaving only those connections that could withstand the test of time and discretion. John Jr. valued these relationships not for their capacity to provide leverage, but for the stability they offered. Trust was extended cautiously, maintained through consistent behavior, and rewarded with mutual respect. The lessons of his upbringing, both its dangers and its teachings, remained useful, but they were now employed with intention rather than necessity. He often reflected on the nature of legacy and its evolving meaning. The Gotti name had once commanded attention, respect, and fear. Its weight had shaped the choices of his youth and defined the perceptions of those around him. Now, legacy was less about external recognition and more about the quiet preservation of life, the avoidance of unnecessary conflict, and the consistent application of discipline. The most enduring influence, he realized, could be invisible, practiced through actions rather than spectacle. John Jr.'s understanding of power underwent a profound transformation. Power, he saw, was not only about commanding obedience or attention, but about preserving autonomy, maintaining stability, and navigating consequence with clarity. The capacity to resist engagement, to act deliberately rather than reactively, became the ultimate demonstration of strength. In renouncing the pursuit of dominance, he had acquired a form of control that was previously unattainable. The past, though diminished in immediacy, continued to inform his understanding of human behavior. Patterns of loyalty, trust, deception, and ambition were etched into memory. He could anticipate responses, recognize motives, and navigate complex interactions without resorting to overt displays of authority. These insights, gained through decades of immersion in high-stakes environments, became tools for life rather than instruments of crime. Observation replaced confrontation, foresight replaced impulse. John Jr. also recognized the importance of self-discipline in sustaining this way of life. Habits that once ensured survival in volatile circumstances were now repurposed to maintain stability and consistency. Routine, mindfulness, and reflection became the pillars of his daily existence. Even mundane tasks were executed with intention, reinforcing a sense of control over a world that could no longer be dominated through fear or aggression. Discipline, he discovered, was the bridge between experience and endurance. Emotional intelligence emerged as a critical skill. Where his former life required vigilance and suspicion, his current life demanded empathy, patience, and adaptability. He learned to navigate social spaces with subtlety, to interpret intention without assumption, and to respond to complexity without haste. The mastery of emotion became as valuable as the mastery of circumstance, allowing him to live fully without the burdens of perpetual threat. The city itself continued to evolve, indifferent to the personal history of its inhabitants. Neighborhoods transformed, businesses shifted, and new generations occupied spaces once defined by established hierarchies. The structures of power that had once commanded respect had largely dissolved, replaced by decentralized networks, technology-driven systems, and rapidly shifting social dynamics. John Jr. understood that survival depended not on adherence to old rules but on the ability to observe, adapt, and integrate into the current reality. Memory, reflection, and observation intertwined to create a framework for living. John Jr. recognized that the past could not be undone, but it could inform decisions, guide behavior, and shape perspective. Experiences that once elicited fear or urgency now provided insight. Mistakes that once carried immediate consequence became lessons that could be applied thoughtfully. Awareness replaced instinct. Reflection replaced reaction. He also came to appreciate the quiet, often unnoticed, aspects of life. Stability, continuity, and consistent practice became the hallmarks of resilience. Small actions maintaining boundaries, choosing associations carefully, observing without interference accumulated into a life defined by control over self, rather than others. In this, he discovered a rare form of autonomy, one not granted by fear or reputation, but earned through deliberate and sustained practice. John Jr. revisited the concept of influence repeatedly. Whereas the world he inherited equated influence with visibility, dominance, notoriety, his experience revealed that true influence could exist quietly. It could manifest through example, consistency, and endurance. By living deliberately and maintaining personal integrity, he shaped a legacy untethered to public recognition, a testament to adaptability and resilience. This understanding allowed him to reconcile with his own identity. The weight of the Gotti name, once a source of pressure and expectation, became a context rather than a constraint. He navigated life, neither in defiance of the past nor in pursuit of its replication. Instead, he crafted a life informed by history but determined by personal choice, demonstrating that survival and autonomy are often more enduring than fame or power. Through these reflections, John Gotti Jr. discovered a profound truth. The most enduring mastery lies not in domination or notoriety, but in the consistent application of awareness, discipline, and patience. Survival is not demonstrated through spectacle, but through sustained practice, thoughtful action, and the quiet management of self. In this, he achieved a level of control that was invisible to others but deeply felt within, a mastery of existence itself. And so, in the stillness of everyday life, he cultivated freedom. Freedom from expectation, freedom from immediate consequence, and freedom from the cycles that had once dictated his choices. In this freedom, John Gotti Jr. experienced the rarest form of fulfillment, the ability to exist fully, deliberately, and consistently in a world he had chosen to observe rather than dominate. By this point, John Gotti Jr. had grown accustomed to a rhythm of life defined by observation, discipline, and deliberate choice. The lessons of the past, etched deeply into memory, now informed the framework of his existence rather than dictating it. The city around him moved with its own momentum, ever-changing, ever-shifting, yet he navigated it with a quiet stability cultivated over decades of awareness and reflection. The ability to exist in such a state, he understood, was a rare mastery, a form of endurance shaped not by aggression, but by patience and foresight. Daily life unfolded with understated complexity. John Jr. began to see patterns and subtleties in interactions that others missed. A glance, a gesture, or a carefully chosen word could signal intentions that were otherwise concealed. Whereas in his youth, such signals had demanded immediate reaction, now they were observed, analyzed, and filed in memory as reference points for future understanding. The mind, once conditioned to respond rapidly to threat, was now repurposed for insight. Observation replaced instinct, reflection replaced urgency, and awareness became a tool for life rather than a weapon of survival. Even as he cultivated this calm, the shadow of the past remained present, never oppressive but persistent. Memories of the streets, the voices of old acquaintances, and echoes of lessons learned under duress surfaced occasionally. Each memory was a reminder that history is not erased but reshaped by perspective. John Jr. learned to meet these moments with equanimity, acknowledging their existence without allowing them to dictate action. In doing so, he transformed inherited experience into guidance, not obligation. Relationships took on new dimensions. The alliances of youth constructed through fear, obligation, and necessity had largely dissipated, replaced by connections based on mutual respect, discretion, and reliability. Trust became an earned commodity, maintained through consistency rather than proximity or reputation. John Jr. navigated these connections with patience, recognizing that meaningful engagement required both awareness and restraint. Influence, he realized, did not need to be visible to exist. Its strength was measured by its subtlety and durability. Emotional intelligence became an essential skill. In the absence of immediate threats, the ability to interpret nuance, anticipate behavior, and respond thoughtfully replaced the necessity for aggression or dominance. John Jr. cultivated empathy not as a strategy but as a natural extension of understanding, recognizing that human behavior is layered with motives, fears, and ambitions that often remain unseen. Awareness of these layers allowed him to interact safely, effectively, and without unnecessary friction. The Gotti name, once synonymous with power and fear, now existed as a cultural reference, detached from the immediacy of threat. Public fascination persisted in media and popular culture, yet it no longer imposed obligation or dictated behavior. John Jr. neither sought nor resisted this attention, he simply allowed it to exist independently, choosing instead to focus on the tangible realities of his own life. Freedom, he understood, was found in the capacity to move through the world without performing for the expectations of others. Reflection on his father, John Gotti, revealed nuances he had never appreciated fully in youth. The elder Gotti had navigated a world in which charisma, audacity, and visibility generated influence. John Jr. inherited a world transformed, where such traits invited scrutiny and risk. By recognizing this difference, he learned to honor the past without imitation, developing a strategy for living that emphasized stability, discretion, and long-term endurance rather than spectacle. Memory served not merely as a repository of experience but as a guide for thoughtful decision-making. Mistakes, misjudgments, and successes were all reframed as data points, providing context for choices rather than dictating behavior. John Jr. learned to weigh information carefully, integrating lessons into a coherent strategy for living that emphasized foresight, reflection, and emotional regulation. He also observed the evolving social and urban landscape with careful attention. Neighborhoods changed, demographics shifted, and new economic systems emerged, reflecting a city in constant flux. The structures of organized power that had once influenced his life were largely obsolete, replaced by networks of technology, mobility, and transient authority. John Jr. understood that survival depended on adaptation, observation, and integration, rather than adherence to outdated codes or reliance on inherited reputation. Daily practice became central to maintaining this equilibrium. Routine, mindfulness, and intentionality reinforced stability, while reflection on past experience provided clarity and guidance. Every choice, no matter how small, contributed to the cumulative effect of continuity. Habits carefully chosen and consistently applied became the foundation of resilience. The discipline, once used for survival in immediate danger, was now repurposed to sustain long-term autonomy. He developed a nuanced understanding of influence, realizing that the most enduring impact is often invisible. By living deliberately, maintaining integrity, and avoiding unnecessary conflict, John Jr. shaped outcomes indirectly. His presence, choices, and behavior provided guidance and stability without reliance on coercion or visibility. This quiet influence, subtle yet profound, became the hallmark of his evolving legacy. Emotional discipline was intertwined with practical awareness. Residual instincts of suspicion and guardedness occasionally emerged, remnants of a life shaped by constant vigilance. John Jr. met these impulses with reflection, integrating them into a framework of measured action, rather than reactive behavior. Over time, this internal mastery reinforced external stability, creating a feedback loop of endurance and autonomy. Legacy, in its truest form, emerged through consistency rather than recognition. John Jr. understood that the continuation of life, the preservation of equilibrium, and the refusal to perpetuate cycles of harm constituted a profound form of enduring influence. The lessons embedded in this approach were not dramatic or public, but they were visible to those who observed with awareness and to the self who practiced them daily. Through years of deliberate living, he cultivated a sense of freedom that eluded him in earlier decades. Freedom from the cycles of expectation, freedom from immediate consequence, and freedom from inherited patterns of action became tangible realities. In this freedom, John Gotti Jr. experienced a rare mastery, the ability to live fully, intentional, and with autonomy in a world once defined by observation, pressure, and inherited notoriety. In the stillness of this practice, he recognized that true survival does not require dominance, fear, or spectacle. It requires patience, reflection, and careful application of knowledge. The mastery of self, cultivated quietly over decades, proved more enduring than the temporary command of others. And in this mastery, he discovered an understanding of life that no degree of fame or power could provide, that the most profound control is the control of one's own existence. With the passage of time, John Gotti Jr. grew increasingly attuned to the quiet rhythms that defined a life unmarked by spectacle or constant crisis. The frenetic urgency of his youth, driven by the demands of reputation, threat, and inherited expectation, had gradually given way to a steady attentiveness, a deliberate observation of cause and effect that allowed him to navigate life with precision. In this environment, survival was no longer dictated by intimidation or performance, but by consistency, awareness, and the careful management of consequence. He moved through his daily routine with a consciousness that had been honed over decades. Each decision, no matter how small, was made with awareness of its long-term implication. Whether choosing a place to walk, a conversation to engage in, or a personal boundary to maintain. John Jr. approached life with intentionality. The skills that had once been used to anticipate threats were now employed to maintain balance, cultivate stability, and protect autonomy. Awareness replaced reaction, and foresight replaced instinct. The city around him continued its relentless transformation. Streets once familiar were now altered by development, gentrification, and shifting social dynamics. Businesses rose and fell, neighborhoods changed, demographics and cultural norms evolved. Whereas the world of his youth had been rigidly hierarchical and power-driven, the contemporary environment required adaptability, subtle observation, and the careful navigation of nuance. John Jr. recognized that survival in this new landscape demanded different skills than those that had once defined dominance. The legacy of the Gotti name remained, though it had transformed. No longer a source of immediate fear or influence, it existed as a cultural reference and historical narrative. Public perception was now shaped by media, entertainment, and folklore, not by direct experience. John Jr. neither embraced nor resisted this attention. He allowed it to exist without interference. Freedom, he had learned, lay in detachment, the ability to move through life without being compelled to perform for external expectations. Relationships took on a deliberate character. Alliances forged in the context of fear and obligation had dissolved, leaving connections built on reliability, discretion, and mutual respect. Trust was earned through consistent behavior and maintained with thoughtful attention. John Jr. observed carefully, engaged selectively, and cultivated connections that reinforced stability rather than risk. These relationships reflected a fundamental shift. Influence no longer derived from reputation or intimidation, but from quiet reliability and long-term presence. Emotional intelligence became central to his continued survival. Where his earlier life had required vigilance, suspicion, and the rapid interpretation of threat, his current existence demanded patience, empathy, and discernment. He learned to navigate social dynamics without reacting impulsively, to interpret motives without assumption, and to respond to complexity with measured clarity. These skills, cultivated over decades of high-stakes engagement, were now applied to everyday life, enhancing both stability and insight. John Jr. often reflected on the lessons of his father, John Gotti, with a perspective shaped by distance and experience. The elder Gotti's era had been one of visibility, charisma, and audacity, where influence could be commanded through performance and risk-taking. John Jr. inherited a world transformed, where such strategies invited scrutiny and danger. Recognizing this distinction allowed him to honor the past without imitation, forging a life defined by discretion, self-regulation, and long-term continuity rather than spectacle. Memory became both teacher and guide. Experiences of success, misjudgment, and consequence were revisited not to relive emotion but to extract insight. The patterns of human behavior, once encountered under duress, were now interpreted with analytical precision. Mistakes became lessons, observations became frameworks for action, and reflection became a tool for sustaining equilibrium. In this way, the past informed the present without dictating it. He also observed the broader social and economic shifts with measured attention. The structures that had once enabled organized influence, hierarchies, networks, and personal authority had largely dissolved, replaced by decentralization, technology, and rapid social mobility. John Jr. understood that adaptation, observation, and deliberate integration were essential to maintaining freedom and stability in this environment. Survival no longer required the imposition of power, it required awareness and restraint. Habits, once developed for immediate survival, were now repurposed to sustain continuity. Daily routines reinforced mental discipline and emotional regulation. Mindfulness, careful attention to interaction, and consistent practice create a framework in which small choices accumulated into long-term stability. Autonomy was maintained not through confrontation, but through conscious, deliberate engagement with the realities of life. John Jr. developed a nuanced understanding of influence. Unlike the visible, performative power that had defined the Mafia, influence now existed in subtle, almost imperceptible forms. Quiet reliability, thoughtful observation, and consistent behavior shaped outcomes without assertion or intimidation. His presence, choices, and approach to life became a form of guidance, not through overt authority but through example, demonstrating that resilience and autonomy can be more powerful than notoriety. Emotional mastery became increasingly important. Old instincts, guardedness, suspicion, reflexive caution emerged occasionally, remnants of a life shaped by constant vigilance. John Jr. met these impulses with reflection, integrating them into a disciplined framework that emphasized measured response rather than reaction. Over time, this practice reinforced stability and self-regulation, create a life sustained by deliberate attention rather than external pressure. Legacy, in its evolved form, centered on endurance and conscious living. John Jr. understood that preserving life, maintaining equilibrium, and refusing to perpetuate cycles of harm constituted the truest form of influence. These acts, though quiet and often invisible, reflected a profound mastery over circumstance and self. By reframing legacy in terms of continuity rather than fame, he demonstrated that survival and impact are not necessarily public or dramatic, but deeply consequential. Through these years, he cultivated an understanding of freedom that transcended physical or social constraints. Freedom was no longer about escaping danger or asserting dominance. It was the ability to exist deliberately, to choose engagement selectively, and to live in a state of mindful autonomy. Each decision, each reflection, and each act of restraint reinforced this freedom, transforming everyday life into a practice of self-governance. Ultimately, John Gotti Jr. discovered that mastery of existence does not require notoriety, power, or spectacle. It is cultivated through reflection, discipline, observation, and thoughtful decision-making. The endurance of life, maintained with intention and awareness, became the measure of true influence. And in this ongoing practice, he achieved a rare and profound understanding that the quiet management of self and circumstance offers a freedom more lasting and resilient than any form of external power. By the time John Gotti Jr. had entered this later stage of life, he had internalized a perspective that had eluded him in his youth. Survival was less about confrontation and more about deliberate engagement with reality. The urgency that had once driven every action, the constant negotiation of fear, loyalty, and expectation was replaced by patience, observation, and careful planning. Life was no longer a battlefield to dominate, but a landscape to navigate, a series of choices to be made with clarity and intention. Each day unfolded with a quiet rhythm. John Jr. moved through familiar streets and neighborhoods with measured awareness, noting changes both large and small. Buildings were rebuilt, businesses emerged and disappeared, and social dynamics shifted subtly. Whereas the past had demanded immediate attention to every signal, he now approached the environment as an observer, capable of discerning patterns without reaction. Awareness had become a tool for sustaining life, and observation a form of security. Even as he cultivated this calm, the shadow of history remained. The Gotti name continued to carry weight, though it now filtered through culture, media, and folklore rather than immediate consequence. Some treated it with curiosity, others with reverence, and still others with casual disregard. John Jr. neither sought nor resisted these perceptions. He allowed them to exist independently, focusing instead on the concrete realities of his own life. True freedom, he realized, was rooted in detachment, the ability to move through the world without performing for the expectations of others. Relationships reflected this philosophy. Alliances forged in fear or obligation had long since faded, replaced by connections built on trust, consistency, and mutual respect. He approached social interactions selectively, aware that meaningful engagement required discretion and reliability. Influence, he recognized, was no longer measured by visibility or dominance, but by the subtle power of presence, example, and thoughtful action. Quiet consistency became the strongest form of authority. Emotional intelligence became central to daily life. Where once vigilance and suspicion had been essential, now patience, empathy, and discernment guided interactions. John Jr. learned to interpret motives, anticipate behavior, and respond with measured clarity. These skills, honed over decades of navigating high-stakes environments, were applied now in mundane contexts, reinforcing stability and fostering meaningful connections without risk. The lessons of his father, John Gotti, provided context rather than command. The elder Gotti had operated in a world of spectacle, charisma, and audacity, where influence was enforced through visibility and defiance. John Jr. inherited a transformed environment, one in which such traits invited scrutiny rather than admiration. Understanding this distinction allowed him to honor his father's legacy without attempting replication, crafting a life that emphasized patience, discretion, and long-term endurance over notoriety. Memory served as both teacher and compass. Events of the past, once charged with immediate consequence, were now analyzed for insight. Mistakes became lessons. Successes offered guidance. Relationships were interpreted for patterns and understanding. Reflection replaced reaction, providing a framework for deliberate living, in which choices were informed by experience but not dictated by it. The evolving urban landscape demanded ongoing adaptation. Neighborhoods shifted, social networks evolved, and economic opportunities were increasingly shaped by technology and mobility rather than traditional hierarchies. John Jr. recognized that survival no longer required coercion or reputation. It required observation, adaptation, and integration into the changing world. The ability to navigate subtle shifts, anticipate developments, and maintain personal stability became more critical than any external display of power. Daily routine became a practice of endurance and mastery. Habits that had once ensured survival in dangerous contexts were repurposed to sustain continuity and self-regulation. Mindfulness, attention to detail, and consistency reinforced stability, transforming everyday choices into acts of deliberate preservation. Autonomy, he understood, was maintained through discipline rather than defiance, reflection rather than reaction. He developed a refined understanding of influence, recognizing that the most enduring effects are often invisible. By living deliberately, maintaining integrity, and avoiding unnecessary conflict, John Jr. shaped outcomes subtly yet powerfully. The quiet consistency of presence and action demonstrated resilience, teaching that influence does not require spectacle, it requires stability, insight, and careful application. Emotional mastery remained essential. Reflexive suspicion, caution, and vigilance occasionally resurfaced, echoes of a life shaped by constant threat. John Jr. confronted these impulses with reflection and integration, ensuring that instinct informed awareness rather than dictating behavior. This practice reinforced internal equilibrium, creating a life sustained by thought and observation rather than fear or expectation. Legacy, redefined, centered on the principles of endurance, self-regulation, and thoughtful living. John Jr. recognized that preserving life, maintaining balance, and avoiding the perpetuation of destructive cycles constituted the truest form of influence. Acts performed quietly, consistently, and without public recognition became the defining markers of mastery. Survival and legacy were now measured by resilience and discretion, rather than by notoriety or power. Through this lens, he found a profound sense of freedom. Freedom was no longer the absence of threat, but the presence of deliberate choice, the capacity to navigate life without compulsion, and the ability to exist beyond inherited cycles. Each decision, reflection, and practice of restraint strengthened autonomy, enabling a life unbounded by expectation yet grounded in responsibility. John Jr. also reflected on the importance of observation in preserving stability. He noticed subtle shifts in human behavior, social interaction, and urban patterns, using them to anticipate change and maintain equilibrium. The ability to perceive without immediate reaction became a form of intelligence that sustained autonomy and reduced risk. In this practice, he transformed vigilance into wisdom. The life he cultivated was a testament to the evolution from spectacle to subtlety. The mastery of existence, he realized, was not achieved through dominance but through thoughtful attention, disciplined action, and the careful management of self. Each day represented a choice, to act with awareness, to maintain balance, and to sustain continuity. These choices accumulated over time, forming a life defined not by notoriety, but by deliberate resilience. Ultimately, John Gotti Jr. discovered that true survival and influence do not require power, fame, or fear. They demand patience, reflection, and consistency. Endurance becomes the measure of mastery, and the quiet cultivation of self emerges as the most profound legacy. In this practice, he achieved an understanding of life unavailable to those who rely solely on spectacle, the power to exist fully, deliberately, and with autonomy in a world shaped by observation, choice, and awareness. As John Gotti Jr. progressed further into the quiet years of his life, he began to perceive the nuances of existence in ways he had never experienced before. Life, once defined by urgency, loyalty, and the need for immediate action, had become a study in deliberate attention. He had learned to navigate a world where the loudest voices did not command the most influence, and where subtlety, patience, and foresight were often more powerful than overt action. Each day became an opportunity to refine the practice of awareness, resilience, and conscious engagement with reality. The city that had shaped him continued to evolve. Streets that once carried familiarity now carried transformation. Buildings were replaced, neighborhoods shifted, and communities redefined themselves. In this changing environment, John Jr. maintained a sense of orientation through careful observation. Every interaction, every moment, and every small detail was noticed, cataloged mentally, and used as guidance for decision-making. Awareness had become his most valuable tool, and reflection had replaced instinct as the primary mode of interaction. While he had distanced himself from the pressures and expectations of the underworld, the past continued to influence his perceptions and choices. Memories of his youth of alliances, conflicts, and hard-earned lessons surfaced periodically, providing context and perspective. Unlike before, these recollections were approached analytically rather than reactively. Each memory was a reference point, offering insight into human behavior, social dynamics, and the consequences of action. Reflection, more than impulse, dictated the terms of his existence. Relationships became exercises in intentionality and trust. Connections that had once been forged under necessity or fear had either dissolved or transformed. What remained were bonds built on consistency, discretion, and mutual respect. John Jr. approached these relationships with measured attention, understanding that stability and trust were cultivated over time, not demanded through visibility or authority. His influence now operated quietly, shaped by reliability and subtle guidance rather than by spectacle. Emotional intelligence was central to his continued survival and growth. In earlier years, vigilance, suspicion, and immediate interpretation of threats had been essential. Now, patience, empathy, and discernment were paramount. He learned to interpret hidden motives, anticipate reactions, and respond in ways that preserved harmony and minimized risk. The ability to manage not only external interactions, but also internal impulses became a defining feature of his autonomy. The Gotti name, once synonymous with power, fear, and notoriety, now existed largely in the cultural imagination. Its influence was filtered through media, folklore, and popular understanding, detached from the immediacy that had once defined his family's presence. John Jr. neither sought nor resisted the attention he allowed it to exist independently, focusing instead on his own deliberate choices. In this way, he cultivated freedom, the freedom to live unbound by the expectations attached to a name or reputation. Reflection on his father, John Gotti, remained a critical component of understanding his own trajectory. The elder Gotti's era had been characterized by charisma, audacity, and visibility, attributes that commanded loyalty and fear. John Jr. had inherited a transformed world in which such traits could invite scrutiny, risk, or misunderstanding. Recognizing this distinction allowed him to honor his father's legacy without replicating it, focusing instead on strategies of patience, reflection, and disciplined living. Memory and experience served as tools for strategic reflection. Past mistakes, successes, and interactions were revisited not to relive emotion but to extract patterns and understanding. Observing cause and effect allowed John Jr. to anticipate outcomes, navigate relationships, and preserve his own autonomy. The skills developed in high-stakes environments were now applied to the subtleties of everyday life, transforming vigilance into wisdom and survival into sustained equilibrium. The social and economic landscape of the city further emphasized the need for adaptability. Traditional hierarchies and structures of power had largely dissolved, replaced by networks influenced by mobility, technology, and social connectivity. In this context, survival and influence relied on subtle awareness, careful observation, and strategic engagement. John Jr. understood that imposing authority was less effective than maintaining discretion and cultivating quiet reliability. Daily routines and habits became central to maintaining stability. Practices, once necessary for survival, attention to environment, mental preparedness, and careful relationship management, were now employed to sustain consistency and resilience. Mindfulness, repetition, and deliberate choices reinforced autonomy, creating a life defined by conscious practice rather than external constraint. Each day became a reinforcement of the principles that allowed him to navigate life successfully. John Jr. developed a profound understanding of the nature of influence. Unlike the overt power of his father's generation, true influence in his life was quiet, subtle, and persistent. It manifested through reliability, discretion, and the careful accumulation of trust. His choices and actions, though often unnoticed by the wider world, shaped outcomes effectively, demonstrate that endurance and wisdom often outweigh visibility and spectacle in determining long-term success. Emotional discipline remained a cornerstone of his existence. Reflexive suspicion and caution, ingrained from years of vigilance, occasionally resurfaced. John Jr. approached these impulses with reflection, integrating them into a framework of thoughtful response. Over time, this practice reinforced a sense of internal control, ensuring that instinct informed awareness rather than dictating behavior, creating stability in both internal and external spheres. Legacy, redefined in this period, centered on endurance, self-awareness, and the careful application of lessons learned. John Jr. understood that preserving life, avoiding unnecessary conflict, and maintaining equilibrium represented a profound form of influence. These acts, often invisible to the world, constituted the truest measure of mastery and survival. Legacy was no longer a matter of reputation or notoriety, but of the sustained practice of life itself. Through this reflective practice, John Jr. cultivated a sense of freedom and mastery previously inaccessible. Freedom was no longer the absence of threat, but the conscious ability to choose engagement, maintain autonomy, and live deliberately. Each act of patience, reflection, and careful decision-making reinforced this freedom, transforming daily life into an ongoing exercise in self-governance and resilience. Observation and attention remained central. John Jr. noticed subtle shifts in social behavior, urban development, and interpersonal dynamics, using them to anticipate change and preserve equilibrium. Vigilance became wisdom, awareness became strategy. By attending to nuance without unnecessary reaction, he sustained a life of balance and adaptability, demonstrating that survival requires insight as much as strength. Ultimately, John Gotti Jr.'s life in this stage revealed a profound lesson. Mastery is not defined by visibility, fear, or control over others. It is cultivated through patience, reflection, discipline, and the careful management of self. Each day, each choice, each act of deliberate engagement contributed to a life marked not by spectacle, but by endurance, adaptability, and thoughtful navigation. In this practice, he achieved a rare understanding that the most profound power lies not in domination, but in the ability to exist fully, deliberately, and autonomously in a world shaped by observation, awareness, and conscious choice. By the time John Gotti Jr. reached the final stages of his journey, he had come to fully understand the subtleties of a life lived in the shadows of notoriety and the quiet endurance that defined true mastery. The chaotic energy of his youth, driven by inherited expectation, fear, and the constant need to assert presence, had gradually given way to a deliberate, measured existence. The city no longer demanded his immediate response. It offered lessons in patience, observation, and thoughtful action. He navigated these lessons with the clarity that only decades of experience could instill, balancing memory, reflection, and anticipation with a sense of calm authority derived not from fear, but from understanding. The environment around him had transformed completely since his early years. Streets that had once served as arenas of power and conflict now carried the rhythms of ordinary life. The rise and fall of businesses, the shifting demographics of neighborhoods, and the evolution of social interactions created a landscape that required careful observation rather than aggressive intervention. John Jr. walked these streets with a practiced attention to detail, noticing the smallest shifts in behavior, the subtle cues in conversation, and the hidden dynamics that governed everyday human interactions. Awareness had become a form of security, and observation a tool for shaping outcomes without exerting dominance. Even as the shadow of his family name persisted, it no longer imposed obligation or fear. The Gotti legacy, once an emblem of power and notoriety, existed primarily in media narratives, folklore, and public fascination. John Jr. neither resisted nor embraced this attention. He allowed it to exist independently of his personal life. Freedom, he understood, was cultivated by detachment, the capacity to move through the world unbound by expectation, unshaped by the assumptions of others, and defined instead by deliberate choice and careful action. Relationships in this final chapter of his life were guided by integrity, discretion, and trust. Bonds forged through fear or necessity had long since dissipated, leaving connections based on mutual respect and consistency. John Jr. engaged selectively, understanding that influence was no longer a matter of reputation or coercion, but of presence and reliability. Quiet consistency, thoughtful listening, and measured interaction became his most potent tools, reinforcing stability both for himself and for those with whom he interacted. Emotional intelligence had evolved into a central pillar of his existence. Where previous decades had demanded rapid assessment of threat and instinctive defense, he now relied on patience, empathy, and discernment. He interpreted motives carefully, responded deliberately, and maintained a calm composure in situations that would have once provoked tension or confrontation. This mastery of emotion, built over decades of navigating volatile circumstances, allowed him to sustain a life defined by autonomy and resilience. John Jr.'s reflections on his father, John Gotti, continued to shape his understanding of leadership and legacy. The elder Gotti had wielded influence through audacity, visibility, and charisma. John Jr. inherited a world where such strategies carried greater risk than reward, and he learned to honor his father's achievements without replicating them. The lessons derived from observation, consequence, and disciplined judgment became his guiding principle, enabling him to navigate life effectively without relying on inherited methods of power. Memory played a crucial role in guiding his choices. Past successes, misjudgments, and observed patterns of behavior offered insight into human nature, social dynamics, and long-term consequences. John Jr. approached these reflections analytically, extracting guidance without allowing emotion or nostalgia to dictate action. The interplay between past experience and present awareness became the foundation of his decision-making framework, allowing him to navigate complex interactions with clarity and poise. The city's evolving social and economic environment required ongoing adaptation. Traditional hierarchies of influence had largely dissolved, replaced by systems shaped by technology, mobility, and decentralized networks. John Jr. recognized that enduring stability depended on subtle awareness, foresight, and the careful management of interactions. Survival was no longer a matter of asserting dominance. It was achieved through strategic observation, deliberate engagement, and consistent, measured behavior. Daily routines and disciplined habits became the scaffolding of resilience. Skills that had once ensured survival under threat, mental acuity, vigilance, and careful relationship management were now applied to maintaining stability and autonomy. Mindfulness, attention to detail, and consistency reinforced both personal equilibrium and social effectiveness. Each deliberate choice, no matter how minor, contributed cumulatively to the broader pattern of life, forming a resilient structure that allowed John Jr. to move through the world with agency and confidence. He developed a nuanced understanding of influence, recognizing that it often operates most effectively in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. Reliability, discretion, and the accumulation of trust became far more powerful than any public display of authority. By navigating life quietly but deliberately, John Jr. shaped outcomes without relying on coercion or intimidation. The invisible architecture of his interactions carried profound weight, demonstrating that true influence can exist independent of visibility or recognition. Emotional discipline remained essential. Reflexive suspicion, caution, and vigilance occasionally surfaced, remnants of decades spent under constant pressure. John Jr. met these impulses with deliberate reflection, integrating them into a conscious strategy of response. In doing so, he ensured that instinct guided awareness rather than dictated action, create an inner environment of equilibrium that supported every external engagement. Legacy at this stage was understood in its most refined form. John Jr. recognized that endurance, thoughtful engagement, and consistent self-regulation were the truest measures of impact. By preserving life, maintaining balance, and avoiding cycles of unnecessary conflict, he shaped a legacy that, while quiet, endured. Influence, he realized, does not require spectacle. It is cultivated in the consistent practice of awareness, discretion, and thoughtful living. Through this careful practice, John Jr. cultivated a profound sense of freedom. Freedom was not the absence of constraint, but the deliberate exercise of choice, the capacity to navigate life independently, and the ability to live authentically without being compelled by expectation or history. Each act of reflection, restraint, and deliberate engagement strengthened this freedom, transforming daily existence into a continuous practice of autonomy and mastery. Observation and attentiveness remained central. John Jr. noticed subtle shifts in behavior, social interaction, and urban patterns, using these cues to anticipate change and maintain equilibrium. Vigilance became wisdom, and insight became the basis for decision-making. In this practice, he transformed a life once dominated by urgency and conflict into one defined by strategic calm, thoughtful engagement, and enduring stability. Ultimately, John Gotti Jr.'s life reached a culmination that few could comprehend. The mastery he achieved was not measured by fame, notoriety, or control over others. It was measured by the consistent, deliberate cultivation of awareness, resilience, and autonomy. Survival, influence, and legacy were all expressed through patient observation, disciplined action, and the quiet navigation of life's complexities. In the stillness of this existence, he discovered a truth often overlooked. The greatest power is not exerted over others, but exercised within oneself. Endurance, thoughtful engagement, and autonomy, these became the cornerstones of a life fully realized. And in this realization, John Gotti Jr. found the rarest form of mastery, the ability to exist deliberately, independently, and fully in a world shaped by history, choice, and awareness. A life once defined by chaos and expectation had transformed into one of deliberate practice, quiet influence, and enduring self-mastery, a legacy invisible to most, but profound in its depth, subtlety, and wisdom. The culmination of John Gotti Jr.'s life, as seen through decades of observation, choice, and experience, reveals a narrative that transcends the sensationalism often associated with the Mafia. This was a life not simply defined by notoriety, power, or fear, but by the painstaking journey of learning to navigate the consequence of inherited legacy, the weight of expectation, and the intricate dynamics of human relationships shaped by extreme circumstances. By the time he reached the later stages of his life, John Jr. had developed a perspective few could truly comprehend. The mastery of existence itself required patience, reflection, awareness, and the disciplined management of both internal and external worlds. From his earliest memories, life had been a delicate balance between survival and assimilation into the shadowed world of organized crime. Growing up under the watchful eye of his father, the infamous John Gotti, meant that observation was a skill honed from an early age. Every interaction, every gesture, and every whispered conversation carried meaning, often signaling loyalty, betrayal, or opportunity. John Jr. learned that influence was not merely a matter of intimidation or display, but a nuanced understanding of power dynamics that required both strategic foresight and emotional acuity. The street became his classroom, the family's legacy a curriculum, and his life the ultimate test of adaptability and endurance. As he matured, the consequences of the family name became increasingly apparent. Every choice was scrutinized by allies, rivals, and law enforcement alike. The mantle of responsibility, inherited at birth, was heavy. Yet, in these pressures, John Jr. discovered the value of restraint. He learned that true control did not come from reactionary violence or bold spectacle, but from measured actions, calculated decisions, and the quiet cultivation of trust. Influence, he realized, could be exercised without spectacle, often most effectively through observation, discretion, and the consistent application of principles. The transformation of John Jr.'s life from impulsive participation to reflective strategy is a critical dimension of his story. Early years characterized by reactive decision-making and immersion in the immediate demands of Mafia life gradually gave way to a more contemplative approach. He began to recognize that survival was not contingent on dominating every scenario, but on choosing battles wisely, understanding human behavior, and leveraging knowledge over brute force. Each lesson, gained through experience, observation, and occasional misstep, contributed to a broader understanding of life, power, and consequence. In this evolution, the raw energy of youth was tempered by the wisdom of foresight. Relationships remained a central focus throughout his journey. Bonds forged in youth often came with obligations, loyalties, and hidden agendas. John Jr. learned to discern the subtle currents within these relationships, identifying allies, managing tension, and distancing himself from those who could compromise his stability. In this context, trust became a currency of immense value. It was no longer given freely but earned through consistency, respect, and discretion. Each interaction became an opportunity to reinforce autonomy, influence outcomes subtly, and navigate the intricate social ecosystem of those who surrounded him. He recognized that influence is most enduring when it is subtle, silent, and exercised with wisdom rather than fear. As the social and urban landscape evolved, John Jr. adapted to shifting realities. The structures that had once governed organized crime, the hierarchical family system, overt displays of authority, and clearly delineated territories had been disrupted by changing law enforcement practices, technological advancement, and evolving cultural attitudes. Success, survival, and influence in this new world demanded an understanding of nuance, subtlety, and the indirect mechanisms of power. Observation became paramount. Strategy became preemptive rather than reactive, and adaptability became the key to enduring relevance. The psychological dimension of John Jr.'s life was equally significant. Growing up under the shadow of one of the most notorious figures in American criminal history meant that identity was inextricably linked to family reputation. Yet, over time, he learned to negotiate this legacy, not as a performance to uphold, but as a context from which to operate. Emotional intelligence, mindfulness, and reflective thinking became his tools. Where once impulsivity had guided his actions, now foresight and discernment ruled. This internal mastery allowed him to navigate volatile social environments, preserve his own autonomy, and exert influence without exposure to unnecessary risk. Throughout his life, John Jr. consistently engaged with the tension between public perception and private reality. The Gotti name carried with it a complex blend of admiration, fear, and intrigue. Popular culture, media coverage, and public fascination ensured that his actions were continuously scrutinized. Yet, he learned that true influence and mastery are not derived from public validation, but from the ability to exist deliberately, maintain discretion, and execute thoughtful actions in alignment with principles rather than expectations. He internalized the understanding that reputation is transient, but the disciplined management of one's own decisions and behavior yields enduring consequence. The concept of legacy, central to his personal evolution, also shifted profoundly over time. Initially, legacy appeared to be defined externally, measured by public recognition, influence, and visibility within the family network. However, John Jr. came to realize that true legacy is constructed internally, through resilience, discipline, and the consistent practice of informed action. Learned that leaving a lasting mark is less about public display and more about shaping the world quietly, responsibly, and strategically, influencing outcomes through example, foresight, and consistent engagement. As he reflected on the past, John Jr. synthesized the lessons learned across decades into a coherent framework for life. He recognized that the cycles of danger, loyalty, betrayal, and survival that had defined his youth were instructive but not definitive. Life could be navigated successfully through the measured application of experience, careful management of relationships, and a deep awareness of cause and effect. He also realized that adaptability, not aggression, was the hallmark of endurance. Those who survive the longest are not necessarily those who dominate immediately, but those who observe, reflect, and act with precision when the timing is optimal. This closing chapter of his life was marked by a profound understanding of freedom. Freedom, John Jr. understood, was not merely the absence of threat or consequence, but the ability to act deliberately, maintain autonomy, and cultivate stability within a complex, unpredictable environment. Each choice reinforced this freedom. Every act of reflection strengthened resilience, and consistent attention to relationships, behavior, and circumstance ensured continued survival without unnecessary exposure. In essence, he achieved a level of control that had eluded him in earlier decades, mastery over himself and his environment. Through this lens, John Gotti Jr.'s story becomes not simply one of crime, notoriety, or family legacy, but a study of human behavior, resilience, and the intricate mechanics of influence. It is a narrative of evolution from reactive youth shaped by external pressures to a reflective, strategic adult capable of navigating life with subtlety, discretion, and profound awareness. He demonstrated that enduring influence is exercised most effectively when it is invisible, cultivated quietly, and sustained through consistent action rather than public performance. In conclusion, the story of John Gotti Jr. offers insights that transcend the world of organized crime. It is a narrative about understanding consequence, mastering self, and exercising discretion in complex social environments. It illustrates that legacy is not measured by notoriety or public recognition, but by the deliberate cultivation of resilience, strategic awareness, and consistent engagement with reality. It teaches that true survival is achieved not through aggression but through observation, thoughtful decision-making, and the patient management of both internal and external forces. This closing narrative underscores the journey of a man who, though born into notoriety and expectation, transformed inherited chaos into deliberate mastery. John Gotti Jr.'s life stands as a testament to the power of reflection, the value of patience, and the enduring strength of autonomy cultivated through awareness and deliberate action. By the end of this story, the viewer understands that the most profound power is not exerted over others but exercised within oneself, and the most enduring legacy is built quietly, thoughtfully, and consistently over a lifetime.